Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where stories drift a little slower, ideas stretch themselves out like someone settling under a warm blanket, and the past opens its hands gently enough to let you fall asleep if you want to. Tonight's story wanders through a world where memory wasn't written on paper first, but in clay, in breath, in starlight, and in the hearts of people who looked at the sky and believed it was speaking. It moves through a landscape shaped by a goddess whose presence was never simple, never soft in only one direction, and never confined to a single role. She was desire in its first spark and determination in its sharpest form. She was connection and conflict, tenderness and intensity, love and war held within the same heartbeat. It might feel unusual to drift into sleep with a figure like that, someone whose mythology is full of movement and emotion. But that's exactly why she fits here. Because stories about her don't rise suddenly or crash loudly. They move the way emotions move. Quiet at first, gathering warmth and weight, then settling again into something steady. The kind of story you can listen to with the lights low, letting the rhythm pull you slowly through old memories of the world and old memories within yourself, all at the same time. So before the story unfolds fully, take a moment to notice where you are right now, the way the room holds its stillness, the way the air seems to settle when evening turns into night. There's a calm that arrives when you're listening without needing to respond, when the world feels gentle enough for your mind to drift wherever it wants. That's the space this story is meant to rest in. It's not here to demand anything. It's here to keep you company as it moves at an easy pace. If you enjoy these calm, slow journeys into forgotten histories and old mysteries, you're always welcome to like and subscribe. It helps this little corner of the world stay warm and keeps these stories flowing to you. But there's no rush. You're here, listening, and that's more than enough for now. The story ahead begins far back in a world shaped by cities made of clay bricks, by riverbeds carved into the earth, and by the steady glow of a star that rose before the sun and lingered after it. People in that world didn't divide their days the way we do now. They didn't segment their experiences into screens and seconds. Their lives were tied to rhythms that moved slowly, rhythms shaped by river floods, planting seasons, and the gentle appearance and disappearance of lights in the sky. Those lights weren't simply decoration. They were companions, reminders that the world was larger than any one person's concerns. Among those lights, one shone brightest. It wasn't as large as the moon, but its brightness cut through the early morning darkness more strongly than anything else. It looked like it was arriving with purpose, and when it returned at dusk, it lingered long after other stars hesitated into view. People didn't understand it as a planet. They understood it as presence, movement, intention. They gave it a story so it wouldn't simply be a light. They made it a goddess so its spiraling rhythm of appearances and disappearances could be understood. That presence became known first as Inanna, later as Ishtar, but long before names were written in clay, she was simply the force that people sensed every time the morning star brightened the horizon. They didn't see her as distant. They felt her near. She wasn't a symbol of one thing or another. She was the entire emotional range of human experience given shape. She was love in its sweetest form, war in its fiercest, desire in its rawness, grief in its depth, courage in its clarity, and longing in its persistence. People who lived in the earlier cities of Sumer didn't separate these experiences from each other. They didn't believe desire lived on one side of a life and conflict on the other. They knew that the same emotions that bring people together can also push them to act, to protect, to fight, to risk, to stand firm. They understood that human experience wasn't tidy, and so their goddess wasn't tidy either. She carried contradictions with ease, because they weren't contradictions to her. They were simply life. Her temples rose high above the city walls, not because she demanded height, but because people built what they loved into places of prominence. They carved lions beside her doors, not to frighten visitors, but to reflect a part of her nature, strength without apology, presence without hesitation. They placed woven offerings, carved figurines, and bowls of grain at her feet, not because they feared punishment, but because they felt connection. The kind of connection that doesn't require explanation. The kind that comes from knowing something larger holds meaning for your life. As generations passed, the stories of Ishtar grew too large to stay in one city. They moved outward along the paths carved by merchants, sailors, and travellers. People carried her name across deserts and coasts. They shared stories of a goddess who understood desire in a way that felt both comforting and frightening. They shared stories of a goddess who walked into conflict with determination that didn't come from anger alone, but from a fierce sense of justice. They shared stories of her descent into the underworld, not as a punishment, but as a journey that revealed how deeply she shaped the cycles of the world. These stories weren't told as lessons, they were told as memories of a living presence. People believed she heard their prayers, noticed their offerings, and responded in ways that reflected her dual nature. When crops flourished, they thanked her. When love took root, they believed she guided it. When armies marched, they carried her symbols, certain that her strength followed them. But her influence didn't end when temples fell into ruin, or when new gods rose to prominence. Her presence simply shifted, softened, and settled into quieter forms. Long after her name faded from public worship, the emotion she shaped continued to move through human life. The intense pull of desire didn't vanish. The fierce courage that rises in difficult moments didn't disappear. The strange, powerful feeling that love can become both comfort and challenge remained. People continued experiencing the same emotional patterns that once defined her stories, even if they no longer trace those patterns back to her. Tonight's story drifts through all of that. It moves through the way people understood her, the way they honoured her, the way they felt seen by her. It moves through the parts of her mythology that shaped identity, culture, and the emotional fabric of early civilizations. It moves slowly, like someone walking through an old city at dusk, noticing the cracks in the bricks, the fading inscriptions, the soft glow of a lantern hanging near a doorway, the echo of footsteps that once belonged to worshippers long gone. It moves with the gentle pace of memory, steady, unhurried, persistent. And as you listen, you might notice the way these ancient stories reflect quiet, familiar parts of your own life. Not in a dramatic or symbolic way, but in the simple rhythm of emotion, in the way you've felt desire warm the edges of your thoughts, in the way you've stepped into conflict when something mattered deeply, in the way connection has shaped you, pulled you forward, and surprised you, in the way courage has arrived at moments you didn't expect, in the way loss has carved space for renewal, in the way you've carried contradictions without ever needing them to resolve into something neat. Ishtar lives in those patterns. She always has. And as this story begins its slow unfolding, it simply invites you to drift with it, to let the rhythm carry you, to let the calm settle, to let the presence of a goddess who once walked through myths and memories settle gently into the warm, quiet space around you. She remembered desire, she remembered war, and she remembered everything in between. And her story continues from here, moving softly into the world that shaped her first rising, the world where she became the morning star, bright enough to guide the dawn and steady enough to stay with anyone who needed her light. There's a softness to the way some stories begin, the kind that doesn't rush or announce itself loudly, but simply drifts into place the way early light slides across a quiet room. The story of Ishtar's rising begins like that, unfolding in the slow hush of dawn long before her name was written in clay or whispered in hymns, before she became the thunderous goddess of love and war, before kings trembled and lovers hoped. There was only a faint glow on the edge of the horizon, a single bright point that appeared when the night was thinning but the day hadn't quite taken its first breath. The ancients looked toward that shimmering star and felt something stir, something powerful and familiar even before they found words for it. In that pale glimmer of Venus, the morning star, they sensed a presence that didn't fully belong to the sky, yet somehow commanded it. As the light strengthened, the world beneath it recognized a rhythm it had felt many times but never named. The Sumerians called that star Dilbat, and in its brilliance they saw the earliest shape of Ishtar. Her story wasn't just connected to the morning star, she was the star, or rather, its meaning. The sky offered the canvas, but the goddess gave it purpose. The people who lived in the river kingdoms noticed how that bright point appeared before the sun, almost as though it was daring the day to follow. They saw defiance in it, and beauty, boldness and tenderness, a balance of fierceness and allure that didn't quite fit into any one idea. And as humans do, they shaped the indescribable into a presence that could be spoken to, offered to, celebrated, and feared. When that star blazed above the plains of Sumer, it was more than light. It was promise. It marked the beginning of a new cycle, a pattern that repeated with comforting regularity in a world that didn't always feel orderly. The people who watched it understood the gift of a rhythm that never failed to return. They saw it rising again and again through seasons of grain and flood, across generations through triumph and collapse. Long before her temple stood on foundations of limestone, long before she held the lion as her emblem, Ishtar rose in the eastern sky as a gentle, dazzling herald of the day. Those early observers didn't separate the star from the goddess. They were one and the same. When she appeared, she was a sign that the world was renewing itself. Fields would warm, markets would open, songs would rise from courtyards and work would begin again. The glow of Venus wasn't simply a celestial event. It was the morning breath of a goddess who seemed to watch over every waking act. Even in these first impressions, she was already a presence that bridged softness and intensity. A figure who could offer beauty and devotion, but also demand strength, courage, and sacrifice. That dual nature didn't develop later. It was there from the start, written in the restless movements of the star that sometimes led the dawn and other times followed the sunset. People recognized her in both roles, the one who begins things and the one who lingers after they end. In these earlier centuries, the identity of Ishtar wasn't confined to a single place. She drifted through myths the way her star drifted along the horizon. Villages along the Euphrates carved her symbol into clay tokens. Fishermen near the marshlands poured out their first catch in her honour. Women who stitched garments in shaded courtyards whispered her name for protection, strength, and love. Soldiers sharpening bronze blades murmured it for courage. Kings carved it into stone as if invoking her approval could stabilise a reign that otherwise rested on sand. She became a companion to hope and determination, as present in quiet homes as in towering temples. Her rise wasn't sudden. It was a slow gathering of meaning over time, the way a river forms from countless droplets. Every person who looked at the morning star saw something a little different. Some saw beauty and romance. Others saw ambition. Others saw fearlessness or destruction or rebirth. The goddess didn't resist these interpretations. She absorbed them. That ability to embody contradictions made her unlike any other figure in the Mesopotamian pantheon. While other gods stayed within their domains, she moved fluidly between them. She wasn't confined to nurturing or ruling or protecting or punishing. She was capable of all of it depending on who called out to her and why. The power of Ishtar's rising lay not in her consistency, but in her shifting presence. She could be whatever the moment required. From the first glimmers of her worship, she wasn't solely a deity of gentle affection. The morning star, for all its beauty, can appear sharp, almost piercing against the fading dark. The people saw that edge and wove it into her nature. She became a figure who loved fiercely and fought fiercely, one who could uplift or unmake, who could guide a king toward victory or ruin him with unflinching decisiveness. There was an honesty in that duality. Life itself held both tenderness and upheaval. To embody only one would have felt untrue. So the goddess mirrored the world and offered a reminder that love and conflict can spring from the same force of desire. The earliest hymns written to her reflect this understanding. They speak of her radiant smile but also her raging storms. They call her merciful and terrifying in nearly the same breath. They describe her arrival at dawn as both blessing and challenge. It wasn't contradiction, it was recognition. As she rose higher in the skies of Sumer and Akkad, her presence took on deeper significance. People saw not just light but guidance. The morning star follows a path that is complex and sometimes difficult to track, appearing, vanishing, and returning in cycles that require patience to understand. Priests observed these movements carefully. They charted her appearances on clay tablets, watching how her behaviour in the sky aligned with events on the ground. When she shone brilliantly, it was said to herald a season of opportunity. When she dimmed or disappeared, the world held its breath, wondering what turning point might come next. In her celestial dance, people found meaning, reassurance, and warning. This connection between sky and earth didn't separate science from devotion. For the ancient Mesopotamians, careful attention to the heavens was part of understanding the divine. Watching Ishtar rise was a spiritual act and a practical one. Farmers learned to read her patterns. Merchants used her return after long absences as a marker for planning journeys. Rulers interpreted her brightness as a sign of favour or disapproval, often shaping decisions that changed the course of kingdoms. Over time, this consistent presence in the sky transformed her role in human life. She was no longer simply a celestial symbol. She became a force woven into the daily rhythm of existence. When her star rose above a sleeping city, it cast long shadows across rooftops and riverbanks. People waking to its light had a sense of continuity. No matter how uncertain the world felt, the goddess still returned. She still moved across the horizon with a confident glow that suggested resilience. Her light drifted through morning mist, touched the tops of palm trees, reflected off irrigation canals, and settled gently over doorways before vanishing into the brightness of day. That rhythm shaped her character not as a distant cosmic being, but as a companion to human experience. She was near enough to feel personal, yet powerful enough to hold entire nations in her gaze. This closeness made her worship profoundly intimate. People didn't approach her with formality alone. They spoke to her about their joys, their fears, their longings. They asked her for help with matters that range from monumental to everyday. In their eyes, she wasn't simply a goddess of great cosmic influence. She was someone who understood desire, ambition, conflict, devotion, frustration, and hope. Someone who responded to emotion as much as to offerings. That made her unique among the gods, a figure who felt accessible without losing any of her grandeur. The deeper her identity rooted itself in the lands of Sumer and Akkad, the more her stories grew. She became the heroine of tales told around hearths and temple courtyards. She became the focal point of rituals and festivals. She was aligned with the flush of new love, the heat of battle, the courage to demand more from life, and the strength to endure its harsher turns. As dawn after dawn carried her star upward, she evolved from a shimmering point of light into a presence that shaped entire mythologies. The morning star was now an emblem of a goddess whose influence reached across cities, rivers, and centuries. The steady rising of Ishtar's star did more than inspire devotion. It offered structure. It marked the passage of time in a world where calendars were still being shaped. Each appearance confirmed that life was cycling forward. It was no small comfort for people living in lands where the rivers could bless or destroy, where kingdoms could rise or fall in a single generation. Her predictable return gave a sense of stability that human endeavours couldn't always provide. She became a symbol of persistence, of beauty returning even after long absences, of light reclaiming the sky after nights that sometimes felt endless. As she rose day after day, generation after generation, Ishtar's identity deepened and expanded. She was the morning star, the herald of dawn, but she was also the evening star, appearing again at the close of day. That cycle gave her an unmatched presence in the sky, guiding both beginnings and endings. People saw this and shaped her story accordingly. She became a goddess of thresholds, transitions, and turning points. No matter where someone stood in their life, she was already there, shimmering on the edge of change. This constant presence made her legacy inevitable. Her rise wasn't simply a myth. It was a pattern written into the heavens and the hearts of the people who looked to her for guidance. With every appearance she made at dawn, she reminded them that nothing stays hidden forever, that cycles return, that strength can be found in renewal. As her story continued to unfold, she stepped from the quiet glow of the horizon into the full expanse of myth, shaping tales of desire, conflict, triumph, and transformation that would define her for millennia. And as that morning star climbed, her influence only grew, leading into the moments that would soon reveal the dual nature that made her one of the most unforgettable figures in the ancient world. There's a quiet truth about powerful figures, whether divine or human. They rarely fit neatly into a single shape. Strength, when carried honestly, gathers layers. It makes room for contradictions. It holds tenderness and intensity in the same breath. In the story of Ishtar, this truth becomes clear almost immediately, because she's not a goddess who chose one path. She walked both. She embodied the softness that draws people together and the fire that tears worlds apart. The rhythm of her myth is woven from affection and upheaval, devotion and danger, comfort and challenge, all coexisting without apology. The people who first worshipped her didn't see these qualities as opposites. They were part of a single presence. They understood that the same force that awakens love can ignite conflict, that the spark which gives warmth can also consume. They saw these truths reflected in daily life, in the rise and fall of kingdoms, in the ebbs and flows of emotion, in the shifting of seasons. So when they looked at Ishtar, they didn't try to divide her. They accepted the entirety of her nature. They praised the moments when she blessed them, and they braced themselves for the times when her attention stirred storms. From the earliest hymns, her followers described her with an intensity usually reserved for an entire pantheon. They called her radiant, mighty, irresistible. They said her smile could breathe life into barren fields and her anger could unravel armies. She was the warmth of affection and the edge of a blade. Her worshippers didn't whisper around these truths. They sang them openly. Her temples were filled with carvings showing her embracing lovers and standing triumphantly over defeated enemies. Both scenes belonged to her, neither diminishing the other. In ancient Mesopotamia, love wasn't just a gentle emotion. It was a force that shaped alliances, marriages, families, and social bonds that determined the stability of cities. Ishtar's influence hovered over all of it. She was invoked in weddings, in reunions, in celebrations of new life. People asked her to bring harmony, passion, and understanding. They believed she could soften anger, soothe despair, and kindle the warmth that turned strangers into partners. These moments of tenderness defined one side of her nature, and they were cherished. But love, especially in the ancient world, was rarely separate from power. The forming of bonds often held political weight. A marriage could unite two kingdoms or fracture them. A declaration of affection could stabilize a reign or fuel resentment. Ishtar stood at the crossroads of these forces. She understood that love has the capacity to influence decisions that ripple far beyond the individuals feeling it. When she inspired devotion, she did so fully, knowing that vulnerability and strength walk side by side. Her myths reflect this reality. They describe her as a figure who moves effortlessly through the world of affection. She chooses lovers without hesitation. She embraces desire with an honesty that defies hesitation. She's unafraid of longing and the unpredictability it brings. In one moment she is comforting and nurturing, capable of deep connection. In another, she's passionate, intense, and unyielding, unwilling to settle for anything less than what she wants. This dynamic presence shaped how her followers saw themselves. It encouraged them to acknowledge that love isn't a fragile emotion. It's a force that can make life fuller and more vivid, even when it's complicated. The stories that speak of her relationship show her devotion clearly. They also show her unwillingness to be restrained. She could love sincerely, yet she refused to be bound by limitations. Her partnerships were defined by both affection and independence. In this, she offered an understanding that love thrives when the heart remains open but not confined. She didn't hide her expectations, nor did she shy away from disappointment when those expectations weren't met. These moments didn't diminish her. They revealed how strongly she believed that connection should carry meaning. But for all her tenderness, Ishtar was equally known for her fury. Her anger wasn't wild or unpredictable, it was purposeful. It arose when she sensed betrayal, injustice, or threats to her authority. The same devotion that made her a goddess of love made her a formidable protector of her own dignity and power. Just as she offered warmth without hesitation, she defended her boundaries with equal intensity. Her followers saw this and respected it. They understood that her fury was part of her wholeness, a reflection of how deeply she cared about the world she moved through. When ancient texts speak of her fury, they describe it as vast and consuming. Armies trembled when they thought she had turned against them. Kings questioned their decisions if they believed she had been slighted. Cities held their breath during moments when her favour seemed uncertain. This wasn't fear born from chaos. It was recognition that even the gentlest hearts contain strength, and that devotion, when wounded, can burn fiercely. In some of her most famous myths, she unleashes storms that sweep across landscapes. She breaks open the gates of heaven. She strides into battle with such intensity that even the gods pause. Her weapons shimmer with the same energy that makes her beloved in moments of peace. The people who told these stories didn't separate her tenderness from her wrath. They understood that both grew from the same place. A goddess who loved deeply would not react mildly to betrayal. A goddess who cherished beauty would not ignore ugliness. A goddess who nurtured life would not stand quietly while destruction threatened it. What made Ishtar so captivating wasn't that she could shift suddenly between these states. It was that they existed together inside her. She could comfort a grieving mother and lead an army in the same breath. She could bless a union with warmth and stand unflinching against an enemy with cold determination. Her identity wasn't fragmented, it was layered. Her capacity for connection made her generous. Her capacity for strength made her fierce. Neither aspect diminished the other. Instead, they amplified each other, creating a presence vast enough to reflect the complexity of human emotion. Her duality shaped the lives of those who worshipped her. When people sought her aid, they understood they weren't appealing to a single aspect of her nature. They were appealing to a goddess who saw the entirety of their situation. If someone prayed for love, she understood the risk and vulnerability that came with it. If someone prayed for success in battle, she understood the personal cost behind the ambition. She didn't offer blessings lightly. Her guidance carried weight because she recognized the full spectrum of human experience. In daily life, her influence was everywhere. A soldier heading onto a field of conflict whispered her name for courage. A young couple offering gifts at her altar hoped she would bless their bond with harmony and passion. A merchant making a difficult decision invoked her strength of judgment. Each person approached her with a unique need, but all of them trusted her ability to understand it. They didn't see her as fickle or conflicted. They saw her as real, as someone who held the world's softness and harshness with equal clarity. That made her relatable in a way few deities were. Her priests and priestesses embodied this duality as well. They guided rituals that celebrated both desire and resolve. They offered counsel for matters of the heart and matters of leadership. They performed rites that acknowledged that emotion and action are intertwined. Their role reflected the goddess herself, a balance of empathy and firmness, of comfort and authority. Serving Ishtar required an understanding of complexity, and those who devoted themselves to her carried that understanding into their interactions with the community. The artifacts found in her temples echo these qualities. Some depict her adorned with delicate jewellery, surrounded by symbols of beauty and abundance. Others show her standing atop lions, gripping weapons, radiating power. In both forms, she is unmistakably herself. The artists who shaped those images weren't trying to show different aspects of her personality. They were showing the complete presence of a goddess who simply refused to be simplified. Her hymns, carved into tablets and spoken in ritual, praise her with language that reflects her depth. They describe her affection as boundless, and her anger as unstoppable. They compare her to a mother and a warrior, a lover and a storm. In those lines, her worshippers captured the essence of her being. They didn't isolate these qualities, they intertwined them, much like her star weaves light through both dawn and dusk. This interwoven identity gave her influence that extended far beyond her own myths. Later civilizations adopted her in new forms, carrying her dual nature into their own stories and shaping her presence to match their cultures. But the core remained the same because it resonated with something fundamental. People recognized themselves in her. Their joys, frustrations, hopes, desires, courage, mistakes and longing all found a mirror in her. She wasn't distant, she was deeply familiar. The dual heart of Ishtar didn't make her unpredictable. It made her complete. She was the warmth that invites connection and the strength that protects it. She was the spark that encourages life to bloom and the fire that clears the way for new beginnings. In her stories, these qualities don't compete. They move together, shaping a goddess whose presence feels fully alive. And as these parts of her nature continued to unfold, her influence stretched even further, leading into the moments when her courage would be tested in ways that shaped not only myth, but the very cycles of life and death themselves. Stories about the divine often move through familiar patterns of triumph and radiance, but every so often a tale turns downward, slipping into shadows where certainty grows faint and the air feels heavier. The journey of Ishtar into the realm beneath the world is one of those stories. It begins not with a declaration or a warning, but with a quiet shift, a subtle pull that draws a goddess of life, desire, and fury into the stillness that waits below. When people first heard the tale, they didn't treat it as a distant myth. They recognized something in it that felt close to the experience of being human, a movement from brightness into dimness, from confidence into unsettling silence, from action into a place where even gods lose their footing. It was a reminder that even the most powerful figures had moments when the world asked them to descend, step by step, into the unknown. The ancient lands where this story was first told were full of transitions. Rivers flooded and withdrew, harvests rose and fell, lives grew and ended. People understood that existence moved in cycles that included both abundance and loss. So when they spoke of Ishtar's descent into the underworld, they saw it as more than a myth about a goddess visiting her sister. They saw it as a reflection of a truth the earth itself kept repeating. Nothing stays in one realm forever. Even the brightest star eventually dips beneath the horizon. Even a goddess of passion and war must face the stillness she usually drives away. Her descent began during a time when her influence was at its height. She was not weakened or uncertain. She was strong, commanding, radiant. Her city's temples were full. Her hymns were sung with confidence. Her presence shaped the rise of kings and the outcomes of battles. Yet something within her stirred. The myths describe it in different ways, but they all circle around a sense of restlessness. Perhaps she sought renewal. Perhaps she wished to challenge a boundary no one else had dared to cross. Perhaps she wanted to understand something that lay beyond life, love, and war. Whatever her reason, she made the decision with the same conviction she brought to every moment of her existence. She turned her attention toward the underworld, the domain of her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen who ruled over silence and endings. The underworld was not simply a place of darkness. It was a realm with its own laws, its own order, and its own gravity. It existed beneath the world of the living, not only in location but in feeling. It was a place where movement slowed, where voices softened, where even memory felt different. The stories say that Ishtar set out toward its entrance with a determination that carried the echo of her star. She did not shrink back from the gates that loomed ahead. She did not hesitate at the threshold where all beings were supposed to leave something behind. She moved forward because that was her nature. Forward through resistance, forward through uncertainty, forward even when the path twisted downward. The gates that guarded the underworld were not one but 7, each one heavier and more imposing than the last. These gates did not simply stand as barriers. They stripped away power, pride, and protection with every step through them. When Ishtar approached the first gate, she carried the full force of her identity. Her crown shone, her garments gleamed, and her weapons flashed with the energy that had toppled armies. The gatekeeper, however, followed the laws of the realm below. He demanded that she surrender her crown before entering. She agreed, not because she was humbled, but because she accepted the rules of the world she was stepping into. The crown came off, and a portion of her power loosened from her. She didn't resist, she stepped through. At the second gate, another piece of her regalia was taken. At the third, more was stripped away. Each gate demanded a part of what defined her in the world above. Her jewellery, her weapons, her adornments, her symbols, all removed one by one until she stood with nothing left but her presence, her will, and her bare identity. To her followers above, she was a goddess of irresistible force, but here in the underworld she moved without those familiar signs. The descent wasn't humiliation, it was transformation. Those who told the story understood that the stripping away of her symbols reflected something universal. When someone steps into a realm they've never known, they cannot carry everything with them. Some things must be left behind. Some things can only be discovered when everything else falls away. As she passed through the final gate and entered the heart of the underworld, she was no longer the dazzling figure who commanded the sky. She was simply Ishtar, not weakened, but revealed. It was here that she faced her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the place where all journeys end. Ereshkigal ruled a domain that didn't celebrate power or desire. It didn't encourage ambition or passion. It held a steadiness that contrasted sharply with Ishtar's vibrant presence. The two sisters stood in a space where neither could ignore the other. Their meeting had the weight of centuries behind it, shaped by roles that rarely crossed. Ereshkigal didn't greet her with affection. She didn't argue or explain. She acted in accordance with the laws of her realm. Those laws didn't bend for visitors, even if the visitor was a goddess of extraordinary influence. The Queen of Death commanded that Ishtar be judged, and the judgment was swift. The underworld didn't reward boldness. It didn't excuse audacity. Ishtar, stripped of her symbols and stripped of her power, was struck down and hung as a lifeless figure on a hook. The moment was stark. A goddess of life, love, and war, still and silent in a world that allowed no movement. People hearing the tale for the first time would have felt a shock ripple through them. The idea that such a vibrant deity could be held motionless was almost unthinkable. Yet the story didn't treat it as a defeat. It treated it as part of a larger turning. The underworld held her in stillness, but the world above reacted immediately. Without her presence, the land began to wither. Animals lost their drive to reproduce. Plants paused in their growth. The cycles that depended on her energy grew thin. The world became quieter, slower, dimmer. People felt her absence in the way the air felt heavier, and the days seemed less vivid. It wasn't punishment. It was evidence of how deeply she was woven into life itself. Her absence stirred concern among the gods above. They understood that the balance of existence depended on her. They recognized that her descent had tipped something that could not remain uncorrected. The gods responded not with anger, but with urgency. They knew that the underworld could not be entered casually, and it could not be exited without care. They sent a figure called a Sushunamir, a being shaped for the purpose of negotiating without force. A Sushunamir did not challenge a Reshkigal or attempt to overpower her. Instead, they used a gentler approach, one that aligned more closely with wisdom than with strength. They appealed to the Queen of the Underworld in ways that respected her authority, while offering her something she needed. The myths describe Ereshkigal as overwhelmed by pain and responsibility, burdened by the weight of ruling the dead. In that moment of vulnerability, she agreed to release her sister under one condition. Ishtar must find a substitute. The underworld required balance. A life returned needed another to take its place. So Ishtar was allowed to rise again, restored piece by piece, as she moved back through the gates, reclaiming her symbols and power one step at a time. Yet this return wasn't simply a reversal of her descent. It carried new meaning. She'd been reminded that even her influence had limits, and that the world she ruled depended on balance just as much as intensity. When she returned to the surface, her journey didn't end. She sought the one who would take her place in the underworld. When she found her consort, Dumuzi, sitting on her throne, adorned in her absence, enjoying the comfort she usually provided, she marked him as the one who would descend instead. Some versions of the story paint this moment with coldness, others with complexity. It reflected not just vengeance, but the reality that cycles of life and death, growth and stillness must continue. Dumuzi's descent brought its own pattern, shaping the seasonal rhythms that would later be connected to planting, harvest, and the inevitable wait for renewal. Through this entire story, Ishtar's dual nature remained intact. She descended with determination. She faced stillness with an openness that few gods possessed. She returned with renewed purpose. Her journey through the underworld didn't erase her power, it contextualized it. People who told and retold the tale understood that descent doesn't diminish strength, it deepens it. Moments spent in the quietest parts of existence can change even the brightest beings. When Ishtar emerged once more into the world of light, she did so with the understanding that every force, no matter how vibrant, is shaped by the encounters that test it. The tale carried meaning far beyond its mythic details. It explained the cycles of nature, the rhythms of abundance and pause, the flow of seasons. It offered a way to understand grief and renewal. It reflected the reality that even the most powerful personalities in life may experience times when the world demands stillness from them, times when familiar strength feels out of reach. Yet it also offered reassurance that these moments aren't endpoints. They are part of a larger pattern, a descent that eventually leads upward again. People who lived by the rivers of Mesopotamia told the story not as a caution, but as a truth woven into existence. They saw Ishtar's descent in the dimming of the sun, in the browning of fields, in the quiet weeks before planting. They saw her return in the greening of the land, in the rush of water, in the reawakening of daily routines. Her journey wasn't simply a myth about gods, it was a story about life itself. The descent into the underworld became one of the defining moments in her mythology. It shaped how people understood her courage, her vulnerability, her strength, and the reach of her influence. She was a goddess who could face the Queen of Death without retreating, who could carry the experience back to the world above, and who could continue shaping life with a knowledge earned in silence. Her story continued forward with this understanding at its core, carrying her into the moments when she would rise once more with the same intensity that defined her star in the sky. The moment a figure rises from darkness carries a certain quiet weight, not because it's dramatic, but because it marks a shift that feels almost instinctive. When Ishtar emerged from the stillness of the underworld, the world above felt her presence again as if a held breath had finally been released. Her return wasn't loud or triumphant. It moved gently across the land, settling into soil, air, and memory. People who lived by the riverbank sensed it in ways they couldn't always explain. Something had changed. Something had resumed. The wheels of the world, which had paused during her descent, began to turn again with familiar rhythm. The stories describing this moment were shaped by the world the people knew. Seasons in ancient Mesopotamia didn't shift dramatically the way they do in colder lands. Instead, they flowed through cycles of flooding, planting, growing, harvesting, and waiting. These cycles controlled everything: food, trade, life, hope. When Ishtar returned to the surface, her presence moved into these rhythms, guiding them the way her morning star guided the dawn. People didn't see her return as a single event. They saw it as the reason life resumed its upward motion. As she stepped through each gate, retrieving the symbols of her power, the world above began to stir. In the stories, this stirring appears slowly but unmistakably. The soil regained warmth, animals regained desire, plants held their breath a little less tightly. The emptiness caused by her absence began to dissolve. The myths don't rush this process. They describe it as a gentle shift from quiet to lively, from held back to forward-moving, from pale to vibrant. The return to light was a moment, but it was also a gradual unfolding, much like the first hints of colour at dawn before the sun fully rises. Her return wasn't simply her own journey. It brought consequences, large and small, that shaped the land's cycles. During her descent, she had been held motionless in a place where growth was impossible. During her return, motion reasserted itself. The idea that the rhythms of nature could depend on the journey of a goddess became central to how her followers understood the world. They didn't see the seasons as arbitrary. They saw them as reflections of her presence. When she rose, life rose with her. When she withdrew, the world paused. Her movement created meaning in the patterns that shaped their daily lives. The return also carried a thread of complexity, because her release from the underworld required a substitute. Dumuzi, the shepherd who held a place in her life, was chosen to take her place below. His descent didn't happen in the same way hers had. It carried its own emotional weight, its own narrative shape, and its own consequences. As Dumuzi moved downward, the world felt another shift, but this one was different. His absence didn't silence desire or stall the life cycle the way hers had. Instead, it created a period of waiting, a space where the land braced itself for his return. This cycle became woven into the turning of the seasons, one part governed by Ishtar, another shaped by Dumuzi. When Ishtar re-emerged into the world of light, the story didn't paint her as unchanged. The descent had left its mark on her. She had faced stillness, limitation, and loss in a way no other god had. Her return carried a depth that made her connection to the world stronger than before. She brought with her a renewed awareness of the fragility threaded through life's movements. The myths don't state this directly, but they imply it through the tone of her reappearance. Life resumed not with reckless energy, but with careful, deliberate warmth. It was the kind of warmth that understands the cold. People saw the return and felt reassurance. Fields that had paused in their growth began to green. Riverbanks softened. The air warmed just enough to hint at the coming cycle of abundance. These changes weren't dramatic. They unfolded through familiar signs. The flowering of date palms, the slow thickening of grain, the renewed movement of herds, the return of colour to the landscape. These signs told people that the world was shifting into a new season. And because the return happened year after year, the story attached itself to the natural world in a way that felt effortless. The connection between her return and the seasons became a pattern passed down through generations. It offered a way to explain why life followed cycles instead of merely continuing without pause. It helped people understand why certain times felt still while others felt full. The descent and return of Ishtar and Dumuzi shaped the ebb and flow of abundance. Their myth offered comfort in the knowledge that even cycles of loss were temporary, that the world would always turn back toward growth. People living with unpredictable floods, scorching summers, and uncertain harvests found security in this interpretation. It gave them a story they could hold during difficult weeks when the land felt dry or unresponsive. When priests told the story at temples, they emphasized this connection. Rituals marking the return of the goddess didn't rely on spectacle. They moved with the same measured calm found in the tale. Offerings of fresh flowers, early fruits, and woven garlands marked the shift. Hymns echoed through courtyards and mud brick halls, carrying words that traced her journey upward. People gathered quietly, listening to the descriptions of how she regained her crown, her adornments, her authority. These rituals anchored the turning of the seasons in meaning. They reminded people that cycles weren't random. They were guided. Her return also touched the structure of the year in ways that went beyond agriculture. People organised festivals, marriages, and travel around the times associated with her rising. They believed that decisions made during her season of light carried additional strength. Craftspeople timed certain projects with her return, hoping the momentum of the world's upward motion would bless their work. Traders set out on journeys when they felt her influence provided clearer paths. Even in city politics, rulers sometimes waited for the season, attributed to her ascent before making proclamations, believing that the support of the goddess would help their words resonate. The story doesn't describe her voice during this return, but it doesn't need to. Her influence moved through actions, not speeches. It appeared in the way water shimmered more softly in canals, in the way breezes shifted direction, in the subtle return of birds to nesting areas. People reading the signs didn't separate these natural details from her identity. They recognized them as her presence. She didn't need to command, she simply needed to exist. Her existence shaped the world around her. The return also highlighted the difference between her domain and her sisters. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld with absolute focus. Her realm didn't change with the seasons. It didn't brighten in one part of the year or grow in another. It remained constant. Ishtar, in contrast, moved through cycles that affected everything. People saw this contrast not as competition but as balance. Each sister held part of existence and each part relied on the other. Without the stillness of the underworld, the cycle of growth would feel incomplete. Without the return to light, the underworld's silence would feel endless. This balance extended beyond the myths. People saw it in their own lives, moments when life required slowing down and moments when it urged them forward. They could identify times of stillness, grief, waiting, hesitation, times that felt connected to Ereshkigal's realm. They could also identify periods of renewal, energy, affection, ambition, times that felt connected to Ishtar's return. The myth offered language for these internal experiences. It gave shape to feelings people couldn't always express. As Ishtar stepped fully back into her world, the stories say that plants responded almost immediately. Barley, a foundational crop, reached upward. Date palms thickened with promise. The shepherds who relied on her influence saw their flocks grow more active. The goddess had not been gone long in literal terms, but mythically her absence had left a shadow over life's forward motion. Her presence now pushed that shadow away. It didn't erase difficulty, it simply provided the energy needed to move through it. Her return didn't make the world perfect. The ancient peoples who told the story knew that life always carried unpredictability. But her return made life feel possible again. It reawakened a sense of rhythm and flow. The tale anchored these feelings in something familiar. People didn't need to track astronomical charts to know when her presence strengthened. They could feel it in the steadier rise of warm days and the subtle shift in the pulse of daily routines. The returning light did not break abruptly across the land. It grew gradually, like an exhale that lengthens with each breath. The cycles of fertility, planting, and growth moved into alignment with her presence. These cycles weren't separate from her story. They were her story, woven into the physical world. When a field flourished, people thanked her. When animals birthed new life, they honoured her. When water flowed through irrigation channels after a long dry spell, her name found its way into the first grateful murmurs. Even years later, when empires rose and fell and new deities entered the region, her connection to the seasons remained. Her presence continued to feel like a return from dimness into clarity. People didn't forget that the world once slowed in her absence. They remembered how her return restored momentum. This story, repeated across generations, shaped how people experienced the passing of time. They didn't simply count months. They felt the turning of emotional seasons alongside the natural ones. They knew that even in difficult periods, there was a promise embedded in the world, the promise of her return. In this way, Ishtar's journey from the underworld wasn't just a tale about gods. It became a framework for understanding life's fluctuations. It echoed the movements of the earth, the behaviour of the rivers, and the cycles of human emotion. It reminded people that life rises and falls, that it dims and brightens, that it pauses and continues. Her return to light wasn't an event to be memorised. It was a pattern to be lived. As her story continued, the influence of her presence shaped not only the land but the people who looked to her for guidance. Her return didn't mark an end. It shaped the path forward. It moved naturally into the next moments, where her power would continue to leave its imprint on cities, temples and hearts across her world. In the earliest moments after her return to the world above, when the land began to breathe again and the rhythms of daily life settled into their familiar patterns, people didn't simply resume their routines. They turned toward the places built in her honour, the structures that held her presence long before dawn lit the sky. These were the temples devoted to Ishtar, and they rose from the earth with a confidence that echoed her own. Each one was a testament to the devotion that shaped entire cities, and their walls carried the weight of centuries of prayer, gratitude, longing, and fear. People who approached them did so with a mixture of reverence and comfort, knowing that these places could hold the full spectrum of what they felt. The first temples dedicated to her weren't grand structures of stone or elaborate carvings. They were humble, modest, built from mud brick and packed earth. Yet even these simple beginnings reflected the strength of her presence. Communities shaped their early homes around these sanctuaries, placing them at the centre of their settlements so her influence could ripple outward into every corner of daily life. Over time, as villages grew into towns and towns into cities, her temples expanded as well. What began as small enclosed rooms became towering complexes, layered courtyards, and monumental gateways. The growth of her temples mirrored the growth of civilization itself. People didn't simply enter these temples with offerings. They built their lives around them. Her sanctuaries served as gathering places during festivals, as sites for legal agreements, as centres of learning, as spaces for healing, and sometimes as safe havens when the world outside became unpredictable. The Temple of Ishtar in the city of Uruk became one of the most revered places in the ancient world. It wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of her authority, a place where people felt they could connect directly with a goddess who held both tenderness and power with equal ease. Those who lived in these ancient cities saw the temple not as a separate part of their world, but as its centre. At dawn, when the sky began to lighten and her star still clung to the horizon, the temple walls would glow faintly. The priests and priestesses inside would move quietly through their morning tasks, lighting lamps, preparing altars, arranging offerings. Their movements were unhurried, shaped by rituals practiced for generations. People trusted these rituals. They believed the actions carried meaning even when they didn't fully understand the details. The temple provided a space where the mysterious and the everyday sat side by side without conflict. Visitors seeking favour might bring fresh grain, carved ornaments, woven cloth, or small clay figures moulded with careful attention. Others brought more personal offerings, hopes, regrets, confessions, private longing. These weren't spoken loudly. They were carried in the posture of those approaching the sanctuary, or in the quiet way someone placed a gift upon an altar. The temple accepted all of these offerings without judgment. It was a place designed to hold whatever people brought to it, knowing that Ishtar could read meaning in both the humblest and the most elaborate gestures. The walls of her temples were covered with inscriptions carved into clay tablets, describing rituals, hymns, and accounts of those who sought her blessings. Some of these tablets spoke of kings who credited their victories to her favour. Others described ordinary people asking for help with matters that felt monumental to them, even if history would never record their names. Through these records, the temples became a kind of memory for the city, a place where the concerns of generations were stored not just in stone and clay, but in the atmosphere that hung within the halls. Her temples weren't quiet in a sombre way. They carried a steady hum of life. The sound of footsteps echoed through courtyards. The scent of oils drifted through ceremonial rooms. Musicians practiced in side chambers where soft drumming mixed with the warm tones of stringed instruments. Outside, markets often grew near temple entrances, where vendors sold food, spices, and small items for offerings. Children played nearby, and travellers from distant lands lingered to watch the rituals, seeing in them a glimpse of a goddess whose influence reached far beyond her homeland. One of the most striking features within these temples was the presence of her statues. They varied widely depending on the region and period. Some depicted her standing tall, holding weapons that glinted in the lamplight. Others showed her adorned in jewellery, surrounded by lions or resting on a throne. These images weren't meant to intimidate or soften. They reflected her entire nature. People didn't expect a single statue to capture every facet of a goddess who embodied such complexity. Instead, each statue offered a doorway into one part of her presence, allowing worshippers to approach her in whichever way felt most connected to their own experiences. Gold played a significant role in these representations, not because it was precious in a material sense, but because its shine reminded people of the light she brought into their world. Clay, on the other hand, represented the earth itself, the same earth that received her footsteps and bloomed under her influence. When artisans combined these materials, they symbolically merged the celestial with the terrestrial, the divine with the human. They didn't need elaborate symbolism to explain it. The materials themselves carried the message. Priests and priestesses who served in these temples were not merely caretakers. They embodied her teachings in their actions, speech, and understanding of human nature. They offered guidance to those seeking clarity. They listened to those who needed a place to be heard. They enacted rituals that connected the community not only to the goddess but to each other. Their roles varied, intertwined with the rhythms of the temple, preparing ceremonial spaces, performing rites, interpreting omens, and leading processions during festivals. Their presence created a sense of stability. People trusted their knowledge of the goddess and the subtle ways her influence moved through the world. Ishtar's temples also served as spaces where justice was sought. Disputes were sometimes brought to her altars with the belief that she could reveal truth with clarity sharper than any human judgment. Petitioners would present their cases, hoping that she would guide the decision-makers toward fairness. Sometimes the resolution came through formal rulings. Other times it emerged from the unspoken understanding that standing before her image required honesty. The temple provided an environment where truth felt heavier in the air, making deception more difficult to maintain. The role of her temples extended even further during times of conflict. When fears of invasion or unrest rose, people gathered within these walls for protection. They sought both physical shelter and emotional reassurance. The belief that Ishtar watched over them gave strength to those who felt uncertain. They didn't view her as a distant figure indifferent to their survival. They saw her as a protector who understood fear and responded to it with decisive force when necessary. The temple's walls, thick with centuries of devotion, seemed to carry that strength. Festivals dedicated to her filled the temples with movement and colour. Her followers celebrated her with dance, music, and offerings that reflected gratitude. These festivals weren't merely for entertainment. They were ways of reconnecting with the cycles of a life she influenced. People decorated the temple entrances with branches, flowers, and ribbons. Priests recited hymns in slow, rhythmic tones that filled the courtyards with warmth. Families arrived in procession, bringing food and small gifts to share. The celebrations transformed the temple from a place of quiet reflection into a vibrant centre of the community. Inside these temples, the air felt different. Visitors often described a subtle shift upon crossing the threshold. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle sense that the world was adjusting its weight, balancing itself around something sacred. Lamps flickered along the walls, casting soft light across murals and carvings depicting her stories. The quiet sound of footsteps on polished floors created a steady rhythm. The effect wasn't meant to awe or overwhelm. It was meant to hold a person gently, offering space for thought, gratitude, or hope. Ishtar's name was spoken in these temples with a kind of familiarity that didn't diminish respect. People addressed her as though speaking to someone who understood the world's contradictions. They didn't hide their struggles or joys. They brought them openly, trusting that she could receive them without judgment. Her temples became places where people could acknowledge the full range of their experiences, from desire and ambition to fear and sorrow. Over time, the influence of her temples spread beyond their walls. Travellers carried stories of her power to other lands. Some adopted her into their own pantheons under new names. Others brought back small clay figures or fragments of hymns. Through these connections, her temples became nodes in a network of cultural exchange. They shaped not only religious practices but also art, trade, and ideas. The architecture of her sanctuaries influenced building styles in distant regions. The symbols carved in her honour appeared in unexpected places, reminding people of the reach of her presence. Even as centuries passed and new empires rose, the temples dedicated to her remained active. They adapted to changing times but retained the same quiet strength that defined her story. Their walls weathered storms. Their altars held thousands of offerings. Their courtyards echoed with generations of footsteps. The continuity of these spaces showed how deeply she was woven into the identity of the people. They didn't treat her temples as relics. They treated them as living spaces connected to the pulse of the world. Walking through these temples offered a sense of how much her presence shaped her followers. The rooms carried impressions of countless prayers. The floors held the memory of festivals and ceremonies. Every carved inscription, every offering vessel, every piece of polished gold told a story of those who had passed through. The connection between the physical space and the goddess herself grew stronger with each generation. Her temples didn't freeze her memory in place. They allowed it to breathe and grow. People who entered them added their own stories to the layers already present. In doing so, they continued shaping her identity, much like artisans shaping clay. The temple, the goddess, and the people formed a living cycle of meaning that remained open and evolving. And as these temples stood at the hearts of cities, their presence naturally led into the way her influence moved beyond their walls, especially in the relationships she chose and the leaders her presence shaped, carrying her story into realms where affection and ambition intertwined. There are stories in ancient mythologies that drift gently through the landscape, touching on themes of creation, or memory, or quiet devotion. And then there are stories that move with a heavier step, stories that remind us that power, once granted, always asks for something in return. The tales of Ishtar and the kings who stood near her fall firmly into the second kind. They carry the warmth of affection and the chill of consequence all at once. They show how a goddess who governed desire and war could raise a ruler to brilliance or leave him broken beneath the weight of his own choices. People who told these stories understood that the relationship between mortals and the divine was never simple. It required courage, humility, attention, and sometimes a willingness to face outcomes that couldn't be undone. Ishtar's relationships with kings weren't the soft, romantic tales recited for comfort in quiet evenings. They were fierce, complicated, and often shaped the future of entire cities. When kings sought her favour, they weren't simply asking for blessing, they were aligning themselves with a force that embodied both tenderness and fury, devotion and destruction. To be chosen by Ishtar was to stand at the centre of a powerful current. It offered glory, protection and legitimacy. But it also demanded something that few rulers understood when they first approached her: unwavering honesty, loyalty, and a willingness to surrender the illusion of control. Kings in the ancient world lived under constant pressure. They governed the movement of armies, the flow of grain, the stability of borders, the expectations of their people. Many rulers sought divine companionship as a way to secure strength in uncertain times. Ishtar was one of the most sought-after allies a king could hope for. Her influence extended across borders. Her protection could turn a battle. Her approval could strengthen a throne. When kings stood beneath her image and asked for her guidance, they were asking for more than luck. They were asking for alignment with the force that governed life's deepest impulses. Among the stories that describe her relationships with rulers, one stands out more than the others. It is the story of Ishtar and Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. Gilgamesh was a ruler celebrated for his strength and ambition. He expanded his city's power, built monumental walls, and sought to leave a legacy that would endure beyond his lifetime. But with ambition came a certain confidence, the kind that grows when victories accumulate, and a ruler begins to believe that nothing can challenge their authority. When Ishtar approached him with an offer of love, he responded not with humility but with dismissal. He listed the fates of her previous lovers, reminding her and himself that being chosen by her was not always a gift. This moment between them wasn't simply a rejection. It reflected the deeper complexities of their characters. Gilgamesh had spent much of his early life trying to assert control over everything around him. To accept a goddess as his partner meant accepting vulnerability, accepting that power could be shared, accepting that affection carried responsibilities just as serious as rulership. He wasn't ready for that, and so he refused her, not because he didn't understand her strength, but because he feared what partnership with such a force would require of him. Ishtar's response carried the intensity she was known for. Her fury wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a reflection of the way she loved, with full presence, full attention, full expectation. When someone invited her into their life, they invited her entire nature, and when they pushed her away, they pushed away a force that didn't take rejection lightly. Her anger sent the bull of heaven against Uruk, a punishment that shook the city and forced Gilgamesh to confront the limits of his strength. The bull was defeated, but the deeper implications lingered. Gilgamesh began to see that power, even divine power, demanded balance. The story marked a turning point in his character. It didn't diminish Ishtar. It revealed how profoundly her influence could reshape the course of a king's life. The story of Gilgamesh was not unique. Other rulers faced the same duality. Some embraced her love fully, offering temples, rituals, and devotion that bound their rule tightly to her presence. These kings didn't see her favour as a simple reward. They saw it as a partnership. They recognized that she valued sincerity, strength, and resilience. They approached her with both reverence and honesty, acknowledging that the bond between goddess and king required more than ceremonial offerings. It demanded emotional truthfulness, something rare among rulers accustomed to commanding rather than listening. Kings who embraced her influence found themselves surrounded by symbols of her protection. Lions, her sacred animals, appeared on palace walls and ceremonial seals. These lions weren't meant to intimidate. They represented a connection to a goddess whose power could steady a ruler's hand in times of uncertainty. The lion symbol existed not only to show her blessing, but also to remind kings that their authority came with responsibility. A ruler who had her support was expected to reflect her values, not only her strength in warfare but her capacity for passion, justice, and loyalty. Stories of her lovers often mention lions not because she commanded armies of them, but because their presence reflected her nature. Lions moved with confidence. They protected their territory fiercely. They approached their lives with a sense of purpose that mirrored Ishtar's own. When artisans carved a king standing beside a lion, they weren't depicting a literal event. They were communicating the idea that the ruler had aligned himself with the qualities she embodied. The lion became a symbol of shared identity, shared ferocity, and shared courage. Some kings who loved her believed that their connection made them invincible. They expected her favour to shield them from consequences, forgetting that her love was inseparable from her judgment. When a king used her name to justify actions that violated her values, when he acted with cruelty or deceit or arrogance, her influence withdrew. This withdrawal wasn't sudden or dramatic. It moved quietly, like a tide shifting away from the shore. Kings who depended on her strength would find their armies losing battles, their advisors turning against them, their confidence fading. She didn't destroy them directly. Their downfall came from the loss of a force they had taken for granted. Inscriptions from ancient temples reflect these dynamics. Some kings wrote of their victories with gratitude to Ishtar, describing how they felt her presence guiding their decisions. Others wrote of moments when they believed she had turned away, leaving them to confront their own failures. These inscriptions didn't shy away from the duality of her nature. They acknowledged that her love was powerful enough to sustain a kingdom, and her disappointment powerful enough to unravel one. Because her influence was personal, rulers didn't approach her casually. They sought guidance through dreams, through omens, through rituals led by her priests and priestesses. A dream interpreted as her approval could embolden a king to expand his territories. A dream interpreted as her displeasure could convince him to change his path. In this way, she shaped political decisions not through direct commands, but through the inner landscape of the ruler's mind. Her presence didn't erase a king's agency. It amplified the weight of his choices. Her lovers included not only kings but warriors, poets, shepherds, and ordinary men whose stories have faded from recorded history. Each of them reflected different aspects of her nature. The shepherd Dumuzi represented renewal and softness. The warriors represented devotion shaped by bravery. The kings represented ambition refined by responsibility. She chose each of them for reasons that didn't always align with societal expectations. She didn't choose based on status or wealth. She chose based on qualities that resonated with her. Boldness, vulnerability, intensity, and the ability to match her passion with their own. The stories of those she destroyed often hold as much insight as those she uplifted. The idea of destruction in these tales wasn't merely physical. It represented the unravelling of pride, the collapse of unchecked ambition, the exposure of weaknesses hidden behind power. A ruler who turned against her or failed to honour the partnership found himself facing consequences not from her hand but from the momentum of his own choices. Her influence magnified both strengths and flaws. Her lovers didn't all meet tragic ends. Some were remembered with gentleness, their stories woven into festivals and seasonal rituals. Dumuzi's cycle of descent and return became one of the most important parts of her mythology. It shaped agricultural practices, celebrations of renewal and reflections on loss. His connection with her wasn't defined solely by romance. It carried a deeper understanding of how life moves through cycles of presence and absence. People who heard these stories didn't interpret them as warnings alone. They saw in them a truth about the balance of desire and responsibility. They understood that love, when intertwined with power, required a certain groundedness. They recognized that relationships in the realm of gods mirrored relationships in the realm of humans, full of promise, full of risk, full of the potential to elevate or break those involved. Ishtar's presence in these stories wasn't meant to be feared or idealized. It was meant to be understood. She was a force that encouraged people to see themselves clearly. Her love revealed the deepest parts of those she chose. Her fury exposed the parts they tried to hide. Her presence held a mirror to ambition, affection, pride, longing, courage, and weakness. She didn't create these traits in her lovers. She illuminated them. The lion became a symbol of how her influence shaped rulers. It represented not only power, but the courage to confront one's own nature. Kings who stood beside the lion learned that greatness required balance, that authority demanded humility, that devotion carried expectations. The lion didn't roar for them. It watched silently, reminding them that their choices determined their fate more than any blessing could. Her relationships with kings formed part of the foundation of her identity in Mesopotamian culture. They showed that she wasn't a distant goddess removed from human affairs. She was present in the very structures of leadership, guiding, challenging, inspiring, and confronting those who held authority. Her relationships shaped the politics, art, and literature of ancient cities. They influenced how rulers framed their victories and how they interpreted their defeats. These stories flowed outward into other cultures as well. As her identity evolved and transformed across regions, the themes of her relationships carried forward. Each new culture adapted her myths, but they kept the core intact. The goddess whose love empowered, whose expectations sharpened, and whose presence revealed the truth within those who sought her. And as her influence extended beyond kings, into cities, rituals, landscapes, and the memories of countless generations, her story continued unfolding, moving toward the moments when entire civilizations would try to define her, interpret her, and carry her into their own unfolding histories. When people spoke of Ishtar's influence, they often described it as vast and borderless, a presence that drifted across rivers and deserts, shaping the lives of distant kingdoms. Yet even with her reach stretching far beyond any single place, there was one city that held her name closer than all others. One city that felt her breath in the morning wind, saw her radiance in its streets, and built its identity around the force of her presence. That city was Uruk. Uruk wasn't just a settlement or a cluster of homes beside a river. It was one of the earliest great cities of humanity, a place where writing first pressed itself into clay, where architecture stretched upward with confidence, where trade routes converged, and where people learned to gather in numbers the ancient world had never seen before. The city had a heartbeat that pulsed through its walls, canals, and temples, and at the centre of this heartbeat, intertwined with every aspect of its rhythm, stood Ishtar. To understand Uruk's devotion to her, it helps to imagine the city not simply as buildings and markets, but as a living landscape shaped by its connection to the goddess. The people who lived there didn't just honour her occasionally. They built their entire world around her presence, carving her symbols into stone, weaving her stories into ceremonies, and carrying her influence in their daily routines. Her temple, the Inanna, rose among the city's structures like a promise, its foundations older than many civilizations that would later rise and fall. For the people of Uruk, the Inanna wasn't just a religious centre, it was the anchor of their lives. The temple complex stood with a mixture of quiet grace and undeniable strength. Its walls carried faint echoes of centuries. Its courtyards held the stamp of countless footsteps. The air around it often smelled of incense, grain offerings, and warm clay. Inside, priests and priestesses moved with deliberate calm through rituals repeated so often that the gestures had become as natural as breathing. Everything about the temple reflected the duality of the goddess it honoured, both gentle and commanding, both intimate and powerful. The Inanna wasn't a single structure. It was a series of interconnected buildings, courtyards, chambers and altars that had grown over generations. Each expansion, each restoration, each new addition carried the memory of the city's devotion. Even when certain rulers rose and reshaped the city, the temple remained constant. It provided stability in times of change, a reminder that Ishtar's presence didn't depend on political power. Her influence wove itself through the identity of Uruk, regardless of who sat on the throne. People in Uruk saw Ishtar as their protector, their inspiration, and their companion in times of uncertainty. When they woke in the cool of early morning, They often began their day by glancing toward the temple as naturally as someone today might glance toward a clock. When merchants set out to conduct trades, they whispered her name. When families welcomed new children or mourned losses, they turned toward her altars. She was woven into the city's identity in a way that felt both deep and effortless. Uruk's devotion didn't arise from fear, it grew from familiarity. The people knew her myths so intimately that her presence felt like part of their own family history. Children grew up hearing stories of her descent and return, her courage, her passion, her fierce protection of those who honoured her. The stories weren't told to frighten them. They were told to explain the world, to comfort during difficult seasons, to anchor them in something bigger than the shifting patterns of everyday life. In daily routines, the love for the goddess was almost casual, carried in gestures so familiar they hardly needed explanation. Someone might leave a small clay figure at the base of the temple stairs as they passed. Someone else might add a handful of grain to a communal basket set aside for offerings. Farmers returning from fields often paused at the temple gates, touching them lightly before continuing home. These weren't grand rituals. They were acknowledgements, like quiet greetings to someone always nearby. Festivals dedicated to Ishtar brought the city to life in ways that transformed its atmosphere entirely. Streets filled with music, dancers and decorations woven from reeds, wool and flowers. People gathered in shaded courtyards while priests recited hymns that drifted through the warm air. Market stalls displayed items crafted specifically for the celebration. Dyed cloth, carved figurines, sweetbreads, and small painted vessels shaped to hold offerings. Children ran between adults with excitement, energized by the vibrant energy that filled the city during these times. One of the most meaningful festivals celebrated her return from the underworld. It didn't require elaborate spectacle. It required acknowledgement, gratitude, and the shared understanding that the world had entered a new season. People reenacted parts of her myth in small processions. They sang hymns that honoured her journey. They decorated the temple with symbols of renewal, fresh greenery, bright ribbons, clean water poured into wide stone basins. The atmosphere felt hopeful, grounded in the belief that cycles always continue, even after moments of stillness. The connection between the city and its goddess also influenced its politics. Kings who ruled Uruk understood that their authority was intertwined with her approval. They didn't treat her as a distant deity to invoke occasionally. They treated her as the heart of the city's identity. Many kings described themselves as chosen by her, protected by her, guided by her. Their inscriptions often credited her with their victories, their prosperity, their long reigns. Even ruling families who came from outside Uruk believed they needed her favour to govern effectively. Without her, the city's support felt incomplete. This deep connection didn't mean Ishtar indulged every ruler. Her relationship with Gilgamesh proved that her influence required sincerity, not flattery. The stories from Uruk show that kings were expected to honour her with respect, not just words. When a ruler neglected his duties, ignored the needs of the people, or allowed arrogance to blind him, her temples recorded the consequences. These records weren't written as threats. They were observations about the balance between power and responsibility. If a king aligned himself with her values, courage, devotion, justice, his reign often flourished. If he attempted to use her name without honouring its meaning, the city's support faded. The people of Uruk didn't worship Ishtar because they feared her. They worshipped her because they loved her. They saw her strength in their city's prosperity. They saw her warmth in their relationships. They saw her presence in the way the fields flourished after her seasonal return. And when droughts came or trade slowed or wars threatened the city's edges, they sought her guidance. They didn't expect her to remove every hardship. They expected her to help them endure and move forward. The architecture of Uruk reflected her presence in ways that reached beyond the temple. Carved reliefs on buildings depicted her symbols: lions standing tall, stars with 8 points, figures with wings raised in gestures of strength or protection. These symbols weren't meant to impress. They were woven naturally into the city's design, as familiar as decorative patterns in a home today. People saw them as reminders of the goddess's watchful presence, guiding them through the rhythms of life. Writers and scribes in Uruk played a vital role in preserving the city's devotion. They etched hymns into clay tablets, recorded rituals, and documented myths that later civilizations would adopt and adapt. Through these tablets, the story of Uruk's connection to Ishtar spread far beyond its walls. Travellers who visited the city carried these stories back to their own homelands. Some returned with small clay seals bearing her likeness. Others returned with fragments of hymns they had heard during their stay. The influence of Uruk's devotion became a quiet but enduring thread woven through the tapestry of ancient history. The heart of Uruk's devotion lay not only in grand ceremonies or political declarations. It lay in the quiet spaces, the moments that didn't make it into recorded inscriptions. A mother whispering a hope for her child before placing a small offering near the temple, a craftsman shaping a clay figure with the intention of thanking the goddess for steady hands, a traveller wiping dust from their face looking up at the temple's walls and feeling comfort in a foreign place. These small expressions formed the foundation of the city's identity. The priests who served her in Uruk understood this. They didn't see their roles as intermediaries standing between people and the goddess. They saw themselves as facilitators, helping people express devotion that already existed deeply within them. Their duties required discipline, knowledge, and emotional clarity. They guided rituals with steady hands. They interpreted dreams with care. They listened to the fears and hopes of those who sought them. Through their work, the temple remained a space where people felt understood. Inside the temple, the statues of Ishtar seemed almost alive in the soft lamplight. Though they were carved of stone or shaped from clay covered in gold, they held a presence that felt deeper than their materials. Their stillness carried meaning. Their eyes, carefully carved, seemed to watch over the room. People who stood before them didn't expect the statues to move or speak. They expected the statues to reflect an essence they felt within themselves. Strength, desire, courage, longing. The statues served as mirrors more than portraits. Uruk's devotion wasn't static. It evolved over time as the city changed. New buildings rose, trade routes expanded, languages shifted, yet the connection between the city and its goddess remained steady. Even as the world beyond Uruk transformed, the city continued to honour her with the same sincerity that had shaped its earliest years. And long after its walls began to crumble and its population dwindled, her name remained etched in the ruins, in the tablets, and in the stories that outlived the city itself. People centuries later might walk among those ruins and feel the faint sense of presence left behind. Not a supernatural force, but the memory of devotion so strong that it pressed itself into the foundation of the place. The wind moving through broken archways, the sand settling over old floors, the silence hanging in abandoned courtyards. These carried echoes of the city that once worshipped her above all others. And as her story continued to move outward, into neighbouring lands, new cultures, and different interpretations, the devotion of Uruk became the foundation for how future generations understood her, shaping the myths and memories that would follow her far beyond the borders of the city she called home. When a deity's influence stretches far beyond the borders of a single city, something interesting begins to happen. The stories shift, the rituals take on new shapes, the understanding of that deity adapts to the needs, memories, fears, and hopes of different communities. And yet, beneath those differences, there remains a familiar thread, an essence that doesn't fade no matter how much time passes or how many terrains the stories cross. Ishtar was one such presence. Her identity didn't remain confined to Uruk or one set of temples or a single interpretation. She moved with caravans, with travellers, with merchants, with rulers, with stories whispered between families at dusk. As she moved, she changed. Not in ways that contradicted who she was, but in ways that revealed how many meanings she could hold at once. Across the lands of Sumer and Akkad, her name carried different tones. In some places, it was spoken softly in the context of love. In others, it echoed with a sharper edge associated with war. Some communities saw her as a nurturing presence who guided new life, while others focused on her ability to challenge the powerful and test the boundaries of mortal ambition. Her identity wasn't fixed, but fluid, shifting, like the rivers that cut through the Mesopotamian plains. People didn't find this confusing. They found it natural. After all, the world around them was full of contradictions, gentle rains and violent storms, fertile seasons and barren years, affection and rivalry. A goddess with many faces fit easily into a landscape shaped by complexity. In Sumer, her earliest form carried the name Inanna. That name meant Lady of Heaven, and it captured her celestial identity with a sense of reverence that reflected the people who first spoke it. Inanna was associated with the morning and evening star, with brilliance that arrived before sunrise and lingered after sunset. The people of Sumer didn't see contradictions in these dual appearances. They understood that beauty and intensity often walked the same path. They saw her as a goddess of love not because she embodied softness, but because she embodied connection, desire, and the intensity that comes with longing. They saw her as a goddess of battle, not because she loved violence, but because she stood firmly in moments when determination was required. In the oldest hymns dedicated to Inanna, her followers described her as a force that brought life into bloom, and as one that wove itself into the momentum of war. They didn't separate these qualities. They praised her for the fullness of her nature. Hymns spoke of her with words that carried echoes of devotion, fear, admiration, and gratitude, all intertwined. The Sumerians didn't try to smooth her edges. They didn't try to choose one aspect to worship above the others. They accepted that her presence mirrored the world's contradictions. As Sumer grew, and as the empires of Akkad rose to prominence, her identity took on new shapes under a new name, Ishtar. This wasn't a replacement of her Sumerian form, it was an evolution. The Akkadians, who spoke a Semitic language and ruled over a vast and culturally diverse region, encountered her through the stories and practices of the Sumerians. They adopted her into their world, carrying forward many traits while also framing her in ways that reflected their own worldview. In the Akkadian lens, Ishtar became a figure even more closely associated with sovereignty, ambition, and the fortunes of rulers. She became a symbol of power that could legitimize control or condemn arrogance. In the stories preserved from Akkadian cities, Ishtar moves with confidence through royal courts, guiding kings, challenging their decisions and sometimes withdrawing her support when they strayed from values she considered essential. Her presence in these stories carries a sharper edge. She's not simply a companion or a patron. She's a force that shapes the direction of kingdoms. Her blessings could strengthen an army. Her anger could unravel a dynasty. People in Akkad didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as a reminder that power, whether divine or human, demanded balance and responsibility. In the transition from Inanna to Ishtar, none of her original qualities were lost. Instead, they gained new dimensions. Her dual nature expanded, her influence deepened. The ways people understood her continued to diversify. In some regions, she remained closely tied to the cycles of fertility and growth. In others, she became the heart of military strategy. In yet others, she was invoked during moments of emotional turmoil or personal uncertainty. The many faces she showed across Sumer and Akkad didn't conflict. They blended, forming a tapestry that was richer than any single thread could express. Her rituals changed as well. In Sumer, ceremonies in her honour often emphasise connection, renewal, and the emotional intensity of human relationships. Offerings focused on sweet-smelling oils, small clay figurines, and recitations of hymns that described her beauty and guidance. In Akkad, rituals often carried a more formal tone. Kings would present gifts that symbolized authority, shining weapons, elaborate jewelry, or valuable goods from distant lands. Military leaders sought her blessing before campaigns. Travellers invoked her name before departing on long journeys. The rituals reflected each culture's understanding of her role in their lives. Despite these differences, her presence remained consistent in one key way. She was always seen as a goddess who moved through boundaries, between love and war, between life and death, between earth and sky. People didn't separate her roles into neat categories. They recognized that she represented transition, intensity, and connection. She stood at thresholds, guiding those who approached them. Communities living along the Euphrates saw her in the fertility of their fields. Communities living near trade routes saw her in the exchange of goods and the movement of people. Communities living near the borders of empires saw her in the tension between conflict and harmony. These differences didn't fragment her identity. They enriched it. Her symbols travelled across these regions as well. The eight-pointed star, representing her as the morning star, appeared on pottery, cylinder seals, jewellery and city gates. Lions, associated with her strength, became common motifs carved into stone. These symbols were understood by people who may never have met each other, people living hundreds of miles apart speaking different languages. They all recognized the imagery and connected it to the same goddess. In this way, she became one of the earliest unifying cultural presences in the ancient world. Scribes, who played such a central role in preserving cultural memory, contributed to this continuity. They recorded her hymns in both Sumerian and Akkadian scripts. They described her rituals in administrative documents. They wrote accounts of kings boasting of her support. Through their work, Ishtar's identity remained fluid but anchored. Her stories didn't blur over time. They sharpened, grew, and expanded. As her influence reached into different regions, she also became associated with different local traditions. Some cities saw her as a protector of marriage and family. Others saw her as a patron of soldiers. Still others saw her as a guide for travellers and merchants. The adaptability of her presence made her one of the most enduring deities of the ancient world. She didn't demand uniform worship. She allowed communities to shape her in ways that mattered to them. This adaptability didn't diminish her complexity. If anything, it revealed how deeply people connected to her. They didn't see her as distant or unchanging. They saw her as a companion who moved with them through the challenges of their environment. They recognized that life rarely fits into simple categories, and they appreciated that she didn't either. Travellers moving from one city to another often commented on the different ways people honoured her. In one city, her temple might be adorned with colourful banners. In another, it might rise in stark, imposing silence. In one region, her hymns emphasised romance and longing. In another, they described her as a fierce protector. These differences reflected local culture, but they also reflected the goddess's willingness to meet people where they were, shaping her presence around their needs. This flexibility didn't mean she lacked a core identity. It meant her identity was spacious enough to hold many truths. She could be a goddess of love without losing her ferocity. She could be a goddess of war without losing her tenderness. She could guide kings and comfort ordinary people. She could oversee rituals of marriage and rituals of battle. She could govern the cycles of fertility and the unpredictable moments of conflict. She could hold all of it because she wasn't a simple reflection of one part of human experience. She was a reflection of its fullness. As the centuries passed, and as the boundaries between Sumer and Akkad shifted under changing political forces, her identity remained steady even as it evolved. Empires rose and fell, rulers sought her support or feared her judgment. Temples were built, destroyed, rebuilt, and transformed. Through all of this, her story continued moving forward. She wasn't tied to one city or one moment. She flowed across the landscape, leaving traces of herself in languages, symbols, rituals, and memories. People living in later centuries inherited a goddess, who had been shaped by countless hands, voices, and landscapes. They didn't see this as a dilution of her power, they saw it as evidence of her endurance. A goddess who could adapt to so many cultures had to be powerful enough to transcend them. This expansive identity paved the way for the next stages of her mythology, where she would not only move across Sumer and Akkad, but beyond them, into lands where her name would shift again, into myths that would evolve in new directions, and into stories that would carry her influence far past the early kingdoms that first honoured her. Long before anyone traced patterns in the sky with precise measurements, or calculated the paths of planets with careful mathematics, people simply looked upward and responded to what they saw. The heavens were a shifting canvas filled with points of light that appeared, vanished, returned, and moved in ways that felt mysterious but meaningful. Among all those lights, one stood out more than any other. It was brighter than the rest, steady in its glow, and capable of appearing both before the sun and after it. That brilliant object was the planet we now call Venus. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, it wasn't just a celestial body, it was the living heartbeat of a goddess. It was Ishtar. Understanding how Venus became intertwined with her identity means understanding the world from which those early observers looked up. They didn't see the sky as empty, they saw it as active, alive, and full of signs. Every star held potential meaning. Every movement hinted at something. And Venus was impossible to ignore. It was the first thing visible before dawn, and the last thing to vanish after sunset. In a world without artificial light, it commanded attention in a way that felt personal. People didn't just observe it, they experienced it. They wove it into their sense of time, their understanding of seasons, their religious beliefs, and their emotional lives. To them, Venus wasn't a planet orbiting the sun. It was the morning star and the evening star, a luminous presence that seemed to act with intention. It emerged from the darkness with a kind of confidence that made it feel closer than any other celestial object. Its brightness cut through the night sky with a steadiness that suggested a force behind it. When it reappeared after periods of absence, people reacted with relief, curiosity and reverence. It wasn't just returning to the sky, it was returning to them. This connection between Venus and Ishtar didn't emerge overnight. It grew gradually across generations of observation and storytelling. The earlier stargazers in Sumer and Akkad didn't have telescopes, charts, or advanced mathematical tools, yet they tracked the movements of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. They noticed its cycles, its periods of disappearance, its unusual path. These observations shaped the myths that would eventually define Ishtar's identity. One of the most striking features of Venus is its cycle of visibility. It appears as the morning star for several months, then disappears from the sky when it moves too close to the sun's glare. After a while it re-emerges as the evening star glowing brightly after sunset. It then vanishes again before returning as the morning star. This pattern repeats with a rhythm that ancient astronomers learned to predict long before they understood the mechanics behind it. They saw this cycle not as a natural phenomenon, but as a divine movement. It mirrored the myths of Ishtar's descent and return, her periods of presence and absence, her shifting roles as both a bearer of light and a figure tied to shadow and silence. The pattern felt symbolic without needing explanation. When Venus brightened in the morning sky, people imagined Ishtar rising with fierce determination. When it shone in the evening, they saw her watching over the closing of the day. When it vanished for a time, they saw her journeying into the underworld. These interpretations weren't forced. They arose naturally from the rhythm of observation. The people felt the movements as much as they saw them. They attributed intention to a light that seemed to guide both dawn and dusk. What made Venus especially unique was its brightness. It often outshone every other object in the night sky except the moon. In a time when light meant safety and darkness meant uncertainty, such a bright celestial companion carried emotional weight. People found comfort in its presence. its return after periods of disappearance often aligned with significant agricultural and seasonal changes. Even without scientific understanding, observers noticed these correlations. They saw Venus re-emerge at times when fields began to stir with new life, when animals shifted their patterns, when river levels changed. These associations built a link between the star and cycles of renewal, making it a natural symbol for both fertility and transformation, because Venus followed a path close to the horizon and shifted rapidly through phases of visibility. It seemed restless. It didn't behave like a distant star fixed reliably in place. It behaved more like a moving presence, a traveller, a messenger, a figure whose actions influenced the world of humans. This motion was essential in shaping Ishtar's identity. She was not a static goddess. She moved between realms. She acted with intensity. She had a rhythm to her appearances and absences that matched Venus far more closely than any other celestial object. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't divide scientific observation from religious interpretation the way we do today. To them, the sky was not separate from myth. It was a continuation of it. The idea that a goddess could manifest through a celestial body wasn't symbolic. It was literal. Venus wasn't representing Ishtar. Venus was Ishtar. Its movements were her movements. Its brightness was her presence. Its disappearances were her descents. Its returns were her ascents. This connection was so strong that priests and astronomers, who were often the same people, developed some of the earliest known astronomical records in human history to track Venus's path. These records, written on clay tablets, meticulously charted the appearances, disappearances, and reappearances of the planet. They transformed observation into a form of devotion. Tracking the star meant following the goddess. Understanding its cycles meant understanding her moods, her influence, and her relationship to the world. These tablets reveal the extraordinary dedication of the people who studied the sky. Without modern tools, they charted cycles with a precision that remains impressive even now. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, one of the most famous of these records, documents Venus's movements over decades. It wasn't created simply for scientific purposes. It was a guide for interpreting the goddess's presence. It helped priests determine when certain rituals should be performed, when kings should make offerings, when armies should prepare for campaigns, and when the city needed additional protection. Venus didn't just illuminate the sky, it illuminated decisions. What's fascinating from a modern perspective is that the cycles of Venus genuinely do align with certain seasonal rhythms. Though not perfectly tied to the agricultural calendar, its periods of visibility often corresponded with changes in temperature, rainfall, and the river systems on which Mesopotamian life depended. Without knowing the underlying astronomical mechanics, ancient observers saw consistent patterns and interpreted them through the lens of myth. In many ways, their interpretations weren't unreasonable. The world around them did shift in ways that roughly echoed the movements of Venus. Their observations, even without scientific context, were grounded in real environmental patterns. The association between Venus and Ishtar also shaped how people understood the planet's unusual behaviour. Venus appears to move backward at times when observed from Earth, a phenomenon we now understand as retrograde motion. To ancient viewers, this reversal looked meaningful. It suggested a change in direction, a turning point in the goddess's journey, a moment of introspection or transition. They didn't see it as a mistake in their calculations. They saw it as communication. A shift in her behaviour was interpreted as a sign of something the city needed to prepare for. Her brightness, which can vary dramatically, was also interpreted through the lens of mythology. When Venus appeared especially strong, Ishtar was believed to be asserting her influence with greater force. When it dimmed slightly, people interpreted it as a sign of her retreat or internal struggle. Every change carried meaning, and that meaning influenced how people responded to their world. These responses weren't irrational. They were part of a worldview that integrated observation, emotion, and spirituality into a cohesive whole. Even the shape of Venus's movement played a role. Because Venus oscillates between being visible in the morning and in the evening, it created natural association between beginnings and endings. Ancient observers saw this and applied it to Ishtar's identity. She became a goddess of transitions, thresholds, and turning points. She guided the start of the day and the close of it. She wasn't tied to one fixed point on the horizon. She travelled, she moved, she shifted with the world. This movement shaped how people interpreted her myths and how they understood her presence in their own lives. As scientific knowledge developed over centuries, the understanding of Venus changed, but the connection between the star and the goddess remained woven into the cultural memory of the region. Even when people eventually understood that Venus was a planet reflecting sunlight rather than a divine presence guiding the cycles of life, the emotional resonance didn't vanish. The idea that a celestial body could influence human behaviour, decisions and emotions continued long after the mythological framework shifted. From a scientific standpoint, Venus is now understood as a world of extremes. Its surface temperature is hot enough to melt lead. Its atmosphere is thick with carbon dioxide. Its surface pressure is crushing. It rotates slowly and in the opposite direction of most other planets. None of this resembles the soft glow it casts in the sky. Yet these harsh conditions don't diminish its beauty when viewed from Earth. The contrast between its scientific identity and its mythological significance reveals something important about how humans relate to the world around them. The people of ancient Mesopotamia didn't know anything about atmospheric pressure or volcanic plains. They didn't understand orbital mechanics, but they didn't need to. They saw something bright, constant, and emotionally powerful, and they formed a relationship with it. Their interpretation wasn't primitive. It was meaningful. It reflected the knowledge available to them and the emotional significance of a light that shaped their experience of time. When the morning star appeared above the eastern horizon, it signalled the start of their day. It guided early workers. It gave comfort to travellers. It provided direction to shepherds. When the evening star appeared, it signalled the close of daily labour, the winding down of activity, the return of families to their homes. These small shifts created the emotional framework through which Venus became more than a light in the sky. It became a companion. As Venus became deeply tied to Ishtar's identity, it provided a celestial map for her mythology. People saw her strength in its brightness. They saw her disappearances in its absences. They saw her dual nature in its oscillation between morning and evening. They saw her unpredictability in its retrograde motion. They saw her guidance in its steadiness. And as these associations layered over each other, they formed a story that felt both cosmic and personal. The scientific understanding of Venus today doesn't erase that meaning. It adds another dimension. Knowing the mechanics behind its movements doesn't diminish the emotional resonance that people experienced thousands of years ago. It reveals how deeply humans respond to patterns, light and rhythm. It shows how myth and science can coexist without contradiction. One explains what the object is, the other explains what it meant. For the ancient people of Sumer and Akkad, Venus was never just a planet. It was the presence of a goddess who moved with them through the cycles of the world. It was a light that guided their days and shaped their nights. It was a companion in times of uncertainty, a reminder that the sky was always watching, always shifting, always offering something to learn. And as the stories continue to travel, shaping other cultures and influencing new mythologies, the connection between the star and the goddess became the foundation for transformations that would carry her far beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia, into lands where her identity would evolve yet again, while still holding the familiar glow of the star that first defined her. There are moments in mythology when the quiet rhythm of daily life falls away, and the stories turn toward conflict. Not the humankind fought across dusty fields or contested borders, but something larger, something shaped in realms where emotions and cosmic forces carried as much weight as steel. In the mythology of Ishtar, those moments didn't arise from chaos or senseless violence. They grew from the intensity that defined her nature. A goddess who embodied love had the capacity to fight with the same depth she brought to devotion. The energy that could ignite desire could also sharpen into something fierce when she chose to protect, confront, or transform. And within these ancient stories there were times when that intensity expanded beyond the earth and reached into the heavens themselves. The idea of wars of heaven might sound dramatic to the modern ear, but to the people of ancient Mesopotamia it made sense. They lived in a world where the sky felt close, where stars seemed to move with intention, and where the gods who governed those lights were intertwined with the fate of everything below. These celestial conflicts weren't imagined as battles with swords and armies. They were shifting balances of power, changes in divine favour, and moments when the emotional weight of the gods tipped the world in new directions. Ishtar, with her dual nature and her unmatched influence over desire and determination, played a central role in these transitions. Her capacity for war didn't come from a love of destruction. It came from an understanding that passion, when applied to matters of justice, ambition, or protection, could take on a sharper edge. In her earliest form as Inanna, she was already associated with the me, the divine principles that governed civilization. These principles included everything from music and law to courage and conflict. To possess them meant to possess the very foundations of culture. And according to some of the oldest myths, Inanna sought these principles with a determination that could easily be interpreted as both ambitious and necessary. The story of her acquiring the me from Enki is one of the earliest examples of her assertiveness shaping the divine order. Enki, the god of wisdom, held these sacred principles. Inanna visited him, shared drink and companionship, and in the haze of celebration, he offered the me to her. When the celebration ended and he realized what he had given away, he tried to retrieve them, sending creatures to chase her. But Inanna held her course. She carried the principles back to her city, establishing her role not only as a goddess of love and war, but as a guardian of civilization itself. This moment wasn't a battle in the traditional sense, but it reflected the tensions that defined relationships among the gods. It showed how divine power could shift, how old orders could be challenged, and how a goddess driven by conviction could change the structure of the world. These early stories laid the foundation for later ones in which her presence in the heavens carried the weight of a weapon. People looked at Venus, a blazing, brilliant light moving across the sky, and saw not just beauty, but force. Its intense brightness and rapid changes in position made it a natural symbol for power that could turn quickly, strike fiercely, and return with renewed strength. They interpreted these movements as signs of the goddess's readiness to intervene, to take a stand, to defend balance or tip the scales when necessary. In many of the myths where Ishtar appears as a warrior, her fury arises from betrayal, injustice, or the need to confront forces that threaten the order she helped build. Her battles weren't random. They followed the emotional logic of someone who felt deeply and acted decisively. These stories often begin with moments of tension, building between divine figures whose desires or ambitions clashed. In that world, conflict among gods wasn't seen as chaos, but as a reflection of the emotional intensity that shaped existence. Ishtar moved through those tensions with a presence that could not be ignored. One of the clearest examples of her divine intensity is the story of the Bull of Heaven. Though often remembered as punishment directed at Gilgamesh, the tale also demonstrates the weight of her divine power. When Gilgamesh refused her love, he did more than reject a goddess. He dismissed the emotional depth that defined her. His refusal wasn't a simple no. It was framed as an insult, a declaration that he feared the pain of being chosen. His response carried arrogance, and in the ancient world view, arrogance had consequences. The Bull of Heaven wasn't just a beast sent to punish a mortal king. It represented a shift in celestial alignment, a moment when Ishtar's power surged in defense of her dignity. The bull's arrival shook the earth. It tore open chasms. It forced the city of Uruk to confront the consequences of its king's pride. The battle that followed wasn't only between the bull and two heroes, it was a battle between a mortal ruler's defiance and the divine weight of a goddess's expectations. The bull fell, but the aftermath left marks that shaped Gilgamesh's life and pushed him into a journey that would redefine his understanding of power, mortality, and humility. This story revealed that Ishtar's involvement in conflict wasn't mindless rage. It was an expression of cosmic balance. When boundaries of respect were broken, she responded. When injustice echoed through the world, she acted. Her fury wasn't senseless. It was purposeful, and purpose carried weight in the heavens. Another tale that reflected her cosmic power involved her descent into the underworld. While this journey was not a war in the literal sense, it created cosmic upheaval on a scale that mirrored the consequences of divine conflict. When Ishtar descended, the world above lost its vitality. Life paused. Desire stilled. The enormous weight of her absence revealed how deeply her presence anchored the balance of existence. The underworld responded with stillness. The heavens responded with imbalance. The gods responded with concern that bordered on fear. This was the power she held, so vast that her movement across realms reshaped the structure of the world. When she was revived and allowed to ascend, a new balance emerged. Dumuzi's descent in her place initiated the seasonal cycles that became central to Mesopotamian life. This exchange, though guided by divine law rather than weapons, carried the imprint of cosmic struggle. It demonstrated that conflict in heaven could unfold through shifts of presence rather than blows. The movement of power, not the clash of armies, defined these wars. The people of Sumer and Akkad didn't imagine their gods sitting on lofty thrones far removed from human experience. They saw them as beings who felt intensely, acted decisively, and shaped the world with the same emotional energy that shaped human lives. So when they told stories of divine conflict, they infused them with the same emotional realism they experienced in their own relationships. Ishtar's presence in these stories wasn't distant. It was familiar. Her role in the divine conflicts wasn't always combative. Sometimes she acted as a catalyst, pushing stagnant dynamics into motion. At other times, she served as a mirror that revealed the internal tensions among the gods. Her duality, love and war, allowed her to move between roles fluidly. She could soothe disputes with emotional insight or intensify them by standing firmly for what she believed needed to change. In some myths, she even acted as a challenger to the authority of other gods. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was recognition that power without accountability could become destructive. When she questioned the decisions of Enlil or confronted the limitations placed upon her, she did so not because she sought dominance, but because she carried a fierce commitment to justice and balance. Her actions encouraged other gods to reconsider their positions, creating shifts in the cosmic order. This dynamic often comes through in stories involving storms, droughts, or moments when the natural world reflects divine tension. The ancient people saw these disruptions not as random events, but as reflections of conflict among the gods. If a storm arrived with violent suddenness, it wasn't just atmospheric pressure, it was a sign that the heavens were unsettled. If a drought stretched longer than expected, it wasn't merely a change in weather. It was evidence that something had shifted in the realm of divine relationships. In these interpretations, Ishtar often played a central role. Her influence over cycles of fertility and renewal meant that any imbalance involving her would ripple through the natural world. Her identity as a warrior goddess became even more pronounced during the Akkadian period. Kings who ruled large empires depended heavily on divine favour to legitimize their authority. They saw in Ishtar a source of strength that could sustain them through campaigns, challenges, and shifting alliances. Her name appeared on weapons, on ceremonial objects, on inscriptions recounting victories. She became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. When armies marched with her symbol at the forefront, they did so with a belief that she walked with them. The emotion this belief generated, courage, determination, confidence, was as powerful as any physical weapon. Yet her support wasn't blind. Rulers who acted with cruelty or arrogance could lose her favour, and without her presence, even the largest armies faltered. This conditional relationship revealed another dimension of the wars of heaven. Divine conflict wasn't always between gods. Sometimes it involved the connection between gods and humans. Sometimes it reflected the emotional distance created when a ruler forgot that divine power demanded humility. When Ishtar withdrew her support, it wasn't an act of spite. It was a reminder of the balance she represented. Her warriors didn't fight for conquest alone. They fought for the values she embodied: justice, loyalty, passion, protection. In her myths, she didn't strike down opponents for sport. She acted when something essential was threatened. The wars of heaven weren't battles between armies of immortals. They were shifts in emotional alignment, episodes where divine purpose met divine resistance, where passion collided with arrogance, where justice confronted excess. These moments shaped the emotional understanding of the people who lived beneath those stories. They saw that conflict wasn't always destructive. Sometimes it cleared the way for renewal. Sometimes it revealed truths that needed to be faced. Sometimes it pushed people or gods into new stages of growth. Ishtar's involvement in these conflicts reflected life's own complexities, the times when change arises from tension, when progress requires disruption, when strength must be used to protect what matters. Her role in these wars didn't diminish her identity as a goddess of love. Instead, it reinforced it. The same force that drives someone to care deeply can drive them to defend what they love with equal depth. The same energy that fosters connection can also foster courage. The same passion that binds people together can push them to confront challenges that feel overwhelming. Ishtar's warrior nature wasn't separate from her capacity for love. It was an extension of it. When ancient people looked at the sky and saw Venus shining fiercely, they didn't see contradiction. They saw unity, a single light that softened the early morning and burned brightly in the night. A presence that guided both beginnings and endings. A force that could comfort and challenge. A goddess who could nurture cities and shake the foundations of heaven when necessary. And as her story continued beyond these celestial conflicts, moving into lands where her identity would evolve into new names and new myths, her dual nature remained intact, shaping how countless generations understood the relationship between passion, power, and the shifting boundaries of divine influence. When a story travels far enough, it doesn't stay exactly the same. It gathers the dust of new landscapes, absorbs the breath of new tongues, and settles into the rhythms of cultures that reshape it gently, with their own memories and meanings. The story of Ishtar became one of the most enduring examples of this quiet transformation. She did not remain confined to the boundaries of Sumer or Akkad. Her influence followed merchants crossing deserts, sailors navigating coastlines, and storytellers who carried her image in their voices. And each time her story arrived in a new region, it shifted. Not by losing itself, but by unfolding into something that fit the world around it. This transformation didn't happen suddenly. It happened slowly, in the way a river changes its course over generations, still moving in the same direction, but with new curvatures shaped by the terrain. People did not forget who she was. They simply found new names for her, new expressions of her nature, and new ways to reflect the emotions she evoked. As centuries passed, she became known not only as Ishtar, but also as Inanna, Astarte, and eventually Aphrodite. Each of these names held a slightly different resonance, but each one carried the unmistakable imprint of the goddess, who had first risen with the morning star for the plains of Mesopotamia. Her earliest name, Inanna, emerged in Sumer long before writing became widespread. The people who used it did not separate the celestial from the earthly, or the emotional from the divine. They said Inanna the way someone might say light, storm, hot, or home, a word that held many meanings without needing explanation. Inanna was the sky and the star, the desire and the determination, the softness that draws people near and the fire that pushes them into motion. Her Sumerian name reflected her origin as a figure who governed the deepest human experiences without being confined to any single form. In the transition from Sumer to Akkad, the sound of her name changed from Inanna to Ishtar. This shift wasn't a division but a layering. The Akkadians brought their own language, their own politics, their own worldview, and when they encountered the goddess worshipped across Sumer, they absorbed her into their culture with the same reverence. They didn't remake her. They renamed her in a way that matched the shape of their speech and the structure of their myths. Ishtar carried all the qualities of Inanna, but also new dimensions that reflected the needs of a region navigating empire, expansion, and conflict. Under the name Ishtar, she became a goddess whose presence touched nearly every part of life. She guided kings, shaped wars, governed love, and moved between realms with confidence. Her temples rose taller, her stories spread wider, and her symbols became recognizable across borders. But even at the height of her influence in Akkad, her story did not remain still. It continued flowing outward. Northwest of Mesopotamia, the lands of the Levant held their own traditions, their own pantheons, their own interpretations of divinity. But they also participated in the exchange of goods, ideas, and stories that flowed through the region. Caravans carried not only valuable resources, but also fragments of culture, songs, symbols, rituals, and myths. Among these cultural threads was the image of a powerful goddess whose identity resonated with the people who heard of her. In that region, she became known as Astarte. The name carried echoes of the Akkadian Ishtar, reshaped slightly by the sounds of the Canaanite and Phoenician languages. Astarte wasn't a new goddess created from nothing. She was the same presence viewed through a slightly different lens. People who lived along the Mediterranean coast saw in her a figure who embodied fertility, sexuality, war, and authority. These traits were familiar, yet they manifested differently depending on the environment. Coastal cities prioritized trade and navigation. Their rituals reflected movement, exchange, and the unpredictability of the sea. Astarte's worship adapted accordingly. She became associated not only with love and conflict, but also with the shifting boundaries between land and water, between stability and danger. Statues of Astarte often showed her with symbols that mirrored Ishtar's imagery: stars, lions, crescent shapes, and gestures of authority. But the art also incorporated local motifs influenced by the coastline, the harvest cycles, and the cultural aesthetics of the region. People didn't see this as changing the goddess. They saw it as revealing another side of her, a side that made sense within their own world. Astarte reflected the blend of tenderness and strength that remained central to her identity. But she also embodied the resilience required to live in cities where trade brought prosperity alongside uncertainty. As Astarte's influence spread further west, carried by Phoenician traders whose ships travelled the Mediterranean, she reached lands that had their own long histories of devotion to feminine deities. Cyprus, in particular, became one of the most important crossroads for her transformation. The island already had traditions of worship centred on fertility, beauty, and the emotional currents of human life. When Astarte's image arrived, it blended almost effortlessly with these local traditions. Over time, her name shifted again. She became Aphrodite. The name may sound distant from Ishtar and Inanna, but the transformation wasn't abrupt. It was a gentle blending of stories, symbols, and emotions. The Greeks who adopted her into their mythology didn't erase her past. They reshaped it into their own narrative forms. They emphasized her role as a goddess of love, beauty, and desire, but the underlying emotional intensity remained similar to the devotion once given to Ishtar. They kept the sense of a goddess who held the full range of emotion: longing, passion, jealousy, warmth, and power. In this new form, Aphrodite became one of the most recognized deities in the ancient world. People today often picture her emerging from the sea, standing on a shell surrounded by foam. Yet even this iconic image carries faint echoes of older stories. The sea foam birth connected her to the waters that shaped the Mediterranean cultures, but it also mirrored the themes of transformation and emergence that were present in Inanna's myths. While the imagery changed, the underlying sense of renewal remained the same. Greek worship of Aphrodite emphasized beauty, attraction, and the complexities of love, but the Greeks also recognized her influence in matters of power, competition, and conflict. In the Iliad, she intervenes in battles. In other myths, her influence sets wars in motion. These stories may be framed differently from the fierce myths of Ishtar, but the emotional logic is strikingly similar. Love and conflict are never fully separated in Greek literature, just as they were inseparable in Sumerian and Akkadian stories. The Greeks may have softened the edges of her warrior identity, but they never erased it entirely. As her identity moved from Mesopotamia to Canaan to Cyprus to Greece, each culture revealed a different angle of her essence. Inanna emphasized sovereignty and celestial authority. Ishtar emphasized desire and war. Astarte emphasized fertility and maritime resilience. Aphrodite emphasized beauty and emotional complexity. These were not separate goddesses. They were different reflections of the same presence viewed through different cultural mirrors. People often assume that mythological transformations erase the earlier form, but with Ishtar the opposite happened. The more her story travelled, the more parts of her identity became visible. She became a goddess whose influence stretched across continents and centuries. She carried her symbolism with her, the morning star, the lion, the eight-pointed star. Yet these symbols adapted to new artistic styles and cultural interpretations. Even as Aphrodite became distinct from her earlier forms, scholars and storytellers could still trace the threads connecting her to Inanna and Ishtar. The emotional force behind her stories remained the same. The sense of a goddess who governed love with intensity, who shaped desire with complexity, who influenced relationships and conflicts with equal force. That essence never disappeared. In many ways, her transformation reflected the movement of people themselves. Cultures shifted, travelled, merged, and adapted. Their stories, gods, and rituals moved with them, reshaping themselves as they encountered new landscapes. Ishtar's journey into Astarte and Aphrodite mirrored human history, full of change, continuity, adaptation, and memory. When her worship reached Rome, her identity became Venus. The Romans saw in Aphrodite a goddess who could guide their ideals of beauty, love, and influence. They aligned her with the power of statecraft, connecting her lineage to Rome's founding myths. Even there, in the heart of an empire that reshaped so many traditions, her presence retained traces of the ancient goddess who had once risen over the plains of Sumer. Across all these transformations, her core never faded. She remained a figure capable of holding contradiction, shaping desire, inspiring devotion, guiding rulers, influencing love, and governing transitions. No matter the name, her presence stood firmly at the intersection of beauty and power, affection and conflict, tenderness and intensity. The story of her transformation wasn't an ending or a dilution. It was an expansion, a reflection of how myths evolve alongside the people who carry them. As her narrative travelled farther across lands and centuries, it continued opening into new meanings, leading naturally into the question of why, despite her immense influence and the countless forms she took, this goddess eventually began to fade from the forefront of human memory in the lands where she first rose. There's a certain quiet sadness in the way some stories shift over time. Not a dramatic collapse or a sudden severing, but a slow drifting, the kind that happens so gradually no one notices at first. The story of Ishtar's fading followed this kind of gentle unwinding. For centuries she stood at the centre of cultures, rituals, languages and cities. Her presence shaped kings, guided lovers, and influenced the rhythm of seasons. Her star burned bright enough to define entire ways of understanding the world. And then, as new empires rose, new beliefs spread, and new interpretations of divinity took hold, the brilliant presence that once moved across the sky began to soften. But her fading wasn't caused by one event. It unfolded through a series of changes: historical, cultural, political, emotional, each one subtle on its own, but together they reshaped the landscape of belief across the ancient world. The fading of a goddess like Ishtar didn't happen because people decided she no longer mattered. It happened because the world around her shifted so dramatically that the pathways leading to her temples, her symbols, and her stories gradually became harder to see. To understand this shift, it helps to imagine the world not as a static canvas, but as a series of overlapping layers. Empires rose and influenced the ones next to them. Cultures exchanged ideas, languages blended, and with every generation the meaning of old stories adjusted just enough to fit the changing times. Ishtar existed in a region where these layers shifted constantly. Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, Assyria, each culture shaped her differently. And while this made her flexible and resilient for thousands of years, it also meant that when larger ideological changes arrived, she was deeply woven into traditions that were becoming harder to maintain. The first major shift occurred when writing evolved from simple economic records into structured literature. Myths that were once transmitted orally became fixed on clay tablets. This change stabilized many stories, but it also created a kind of fossilization. Living rituals and personal devotion weren't always captured in writing, and those living elements often faded more quickly than the texts. Ishtar's presence in daily life depended on rituals that connected her to the turning of seasons, the rising of Venus, and the emotional lives of her followers. When those rituals were interrupted by war, famine, or political collapse, the connection weakened. Another shift came through political change. Empires didn't just influence borders, they influenced religion. A new ruler could elevate certain gods and diminish others. Over centuries, this constant reshuffling changed the hierarchy of deities. Ishtar remained powerful for much of this period, but she existed in a divine landscape filled with competition. Some gods gained prominence because their stories resonated with a particular moment in time. Others became associated with state-sponsored rituals that gave them political importance. The rise of Marduk in Babylon provides one example. As Babylon grew into a dominant power, its rulers elevated Marduk as the head of the pantheon. This didn't erase Ishtar immediately, but it changed the focus of official worship. The tablets, the rituals, and the festivals increasingly centered on Marduk's authority. Ishtar still appeared in myths, and still held influence, but the cultural spotlight slowly shifted away. Her stories didn't vanish. They simply became part of a larger collection rather than the defining force of a region. The Assyrians later shifted emphasis again, focusing heavily on Ashur. As they expanded their empire, their divine framework followed. And even though Ishtar remained important in certain Assyrian cities, especially Nineveh, where she had a major temple, her presence became attached to regional traditions instead of being a unifying figure across the land. When an empire fractured, the gods associated with it often fractured with it. Their reach shrank with the territory. These changes didn't diminish her emotional resonance. They just reduced her political and ceremonial prominence. Devotion doesn't disappear immediately when structures collapse, but over time, the absence of public rituals, temple funding, and centralized authority makes it harder for older traditions to remain visible. Another reason for her fading emerged through cultural blending. As ideas moved along trade routes, local deities merged with foreign ones. This blending wasn't destructive, it allowed Ishtar to travel. But it also meant that her identity gradually became absorbed into other gods. In the Hittite regions, she merged with local goddesses. In the Levant, she transformed into Astarte. In Greece, parts of her essence shifted into Aphrodite. In Rome, those qualities became Venus. This wasn't erasure, it was transformation. But it meant that the name Ishtar, once spoken with reverence across Mesopotamia, became one name among many. People who worshipped the later forms didn't always realise they were interacting with a goddess whose origins stretched back to the earlier cities on Earth. The emotional essence remained, but the connection to her original identity grew thinner. Religion in the ancient world didn't remain static. New belief systems emerged that emphasised different values, different stories, and different relationships between humans and the divine. As monotheism spread across the region, it began to reshape spiritual landscapes with unparalleled force. These new systems didn't leave room for pantheons of gods interacting, competing, and blending. They focused on singular divine authority. This shift didn't happen overnight. It moved slowly, over generations, through migrations, political changes, and cultural adaptation. In the early stages of this transition, many older gods weren't rejected outright. They were simply reframed. Some became angels, some became symbols, some became historical figures wrapped in layers of reinterpretation. Others faded because their roles were no longer compatible with the new theological structures. Ishtar, with her dual nature, love and war, desire and destruction, tenderness and fury, didn't fit easily into these evolving frameworks. She was too complex, too independent, too emotionally vivid. And so, her presence gradually shifted into memory. The fading of a goddess, however, doesn't mean disappearance. It means her influence settles into quiet places, books, artifacts, linguistic remnants, cultural echoes. It means she remains present in ways that are harder to notice, but still woven into human behaviour. Even after her temples fell silent, the emotional patterns she once embodied continued shaping stories in subtle ways. The idea of a goddess who governs both passion and conflict didn't vanish. It resurfaced in countless forms, in later mythologies, in literature, in symbols of feminine authority, in concepts of desire that refused to fit into narrow definitions. The name Ishtar may not have carried the same weight in later generations, but her presence remained encoded in the very structures of love and war in ancient storytelling. The hierarchy of gods may have shifted, but the emotional truth she represented didn't. People continued to feel the same intensity she once personified. They experienced longing, ambition, conflict, hope, renewal, and although they no longer knew her name, they moved through the world with emotions shaped by stories that once centered around her. Another quiet layer of her fading came from changes in astronomy. As scientific understanding grew, the connection between Venus and divinity weakened. The morning star didn't lose its beauty, but it lost the mythic force once associated with it. When people no longer saw the star as a living presence, they no longer felt compelled to interpret its movements as signs from a goddess. This shift didn't diminish the awe of the sky, but it changed the emotional relationship between people and celestial bodies. The disappearance of her active worship across Mesopotamia wasn't a disappearance of memory. Each abandoned temple carried traces of the countless generations who walked through its halls. Each statue, each tablet, each carved seal holds something of her presence. Archaeologists uncover these artifacts now and feel the depth of a world that once breathed through stories of her. Scholars read her hymns and sense a voice that shaped the earliest literature on Earth. Even today, when people look at the morning star, they unknowingly look at the light that once defined her identity. Her fading wasn't a punishment or a failure. It was part of the natural evolution of cultures. Deities, like languages, cities, and traditions, change as the world changes. Some remain in the forefront. Others settle quietly into the fabric of memory. Ishtar did both. She transformed into goddesses that later cultures embraced, and she remained preserved in the oldest tablets that humanity ever carved. Her power didn't vanish, it dispersed. And while her name may no longer echo through temples the way it once did, the story of her influence still moves through the world in ways that connect the past to the present, leading naturally toward the last part of her journey, where her presence endures in places far quieter than ancient cities, but no less meaningful. When a story survives the fall of cities, the the shift of languages and the quiet erosion of time, it suggests something deeper than memory alone. It suggests a pattern, a resonance, a thread woven so gently through human experience that even when the name changes or the rituals vanish, the essence remains. Ishtar may no longer rule temples or stand at the centre of festivals, but in softer, quieter ways, she remains woven into the lives of people who have never heard her name. Her presence persists not through statues or hymns, but through the emotions, impulses, choices, and contradictions that shaped her mythology in the first place. The ancient people who worshipped her didn't see her as an abstract idea. They saw her as a force that shaped the most intimate parts of human life. She represented the intensity of desire, the courage required for change, the tension between vulnerability and strength, the beauty of connection, and the power that rises in moments of conflict. These experiences didn't belong only to the ancient world. They belong to everyone who has lived since. And that continuity, subtle as it may be, is how the memory of Ishtar continues to shine. To understand how she lives within us now, you don't need to look for her temples or trace the path of her star across the horizon. You can simply observe the moments when your own emotions pull you in two directions at once, when affection deepens into longing, when determination sharpens in moments of challenge, when gentleness coexists with strength, when love and anger sit side by side in the same heartbeat. These contradictions weren't flaws to the people who honoured her. They were part of the fullness of being alive. Her ancient worshippers believed that intense emotions connected people to something beyond themselves. Love wasn't just a feeling. It was a force that reshaped decisions, destinies, and relationships. War wasn't just conflict. It was the expression of passion pushed to its most extreme form. They saw these forces not as separate but as intertwined. That duality was central to Ishtar's identity, and that duality remains central to human nature. Today, when people speak of love, they often talk about it with tenderness, comfort, warmth, safety. But they also understand its disruptive power. Falling in love can overturn plans, redefine priorities, open unexpected possibilities, and expose vulnerabilities that might otherwise remain hidden. Love can inspire extraordinary acts of kindness and courage. It can also ignite jealousy, longing, or fear. Human beings didn't invent these contradictions recently. They have always been part of the emotional landscape. The people of ancient Mesopotamia saw this clearly, and they expressed it through the image of a goddess who embodied both desire and determination. When people today speak of conflict, they often describe it in terms of disagreement or opposition. But deeper conflict, internal or external, often arises from passion. People fight for what they care about. They defend what they cherish. They confront what threatens their values. Even quiet internal battles often stem from the same emotional intensity that shaped Ishtar's stories. The ancient people didn't imagine her as a goddess who sought conflict without purpose. They imagined her as someone who fought to protect the core of what mattered. Someone whose passion could become force when needed. These emotional patterns haven't disappeared. They are part of why her memory still feels recognizable, even in a world that no longer speaks her name. The dual nature she represented continues to appear in human stories, human relationships, and human art. Countless characters in literature echo her contradictions, figures who are tender and fierce, loving and relentless, compassionate and unwilling to surrender. Countless works of art depict the intertwined nature of desire and strength. Countless personal experiences reflect that same inner tension. Even the way people talk about the morning star carries the faintest traces of her memory. When someone notices Venus shining in the sky, even without knowing its ancient associations, they respond to its brightness in a way that mirrors how people responded thousands of years ago. The morning star still feels calm, steady, and strangely comforting. It still stands out against the fading or gathering light. It still anchors the horizon during moments of transition. just as Ishtar once anchored the emotional transitions in the myths of her worshippers. Her memory also survives through language, often in ways that pass unnoticed. Words connected to desire, passion, attraction, beauty, conflict and determination frequently echo themes that once defined her rituals. Many of the stories that shaped Western literature emerged from traditions influenced by her later forms, Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus. And because the stories tied to those later names carried forward the parts of her identity, their influence filtered into modern narratives, creating emotional patterns that still resonate in films, novels, and even everyday conversations. It's easy to assume that when a goddess fades from active worship, her memory dissolves completely. But that isn't how cultural memory works. It doesn't vanish, it disperses. It becomes part of the emotional vocabulary people use without thinking. It becomes part of the stories children hear long before they learn the origins behind them. It becomes part of the metaphors people use to describe intense experiences. It becomes part of the quiet ways people understand themselves. Ishtar also survives in the way people explore their own duality. Modern society often encourages separation. Strong or soft, gentle or fierce, independent or connected. But human beings are rarely that simple. They carry both tenderness and intensity. They carry affection and anger. They carry longing and fear. They carry ambition and hesitation. The ancient myths didn't try to simplify this complexity. They embraced it. In telling stories about a goddess who embodied contradictions, they normalized the idea that emotion is not linear or singular. It is layered. People today still experience those layers. When someone finds themselves moving through a moment of intense love and intense frustration at the same time, they're touching the same emotional spectrum that shaped Ishtar's mythology. When someone feels drawn toward change, but also frightened of what that change might require, they're experiencing the same tension expressed in her stories of descent and return. When someone acts with courage to protect someone they care about, even through fear or uncertainty, they're participating in the emotional legacy she once represented. Ishtar also lives on in concepts of empowerment. In her earliest myths, she stood as a figure who refused to shrink her presence to make others comfortable. She took action when she believed action was necessary. She pursued what she desired. She claimed authority in a world shaped by powerful gods. She didn't fit neatly into expectations. She defined her own identity. These traits resonate deeply today. People talk about empowerment, agency, and self-definition without realizing they're expressing ideas that once formed the core of her worship. When someone decides to pursue a path that others believe is too ambitious, or when someone refuses to hide their emotional intensity to make others more comfortable, they are echoing the emotional independence that defined her mythology. Her memory also continues in the quiet strength people draw from her emotional resilience. In the myths, she experienced loss, betrayal, rejection, and challenge. Yet she returned each time, changed, but not diminished. Her descent into the underworld was not simply a symbolic tale of death and rebirth. It reflected the emotional truth that people often pass through moments of darkness only to emerge with new understanding. That pattern appears in countless modern stories, self-reflections, and psychological frameworks. People speak of hitting bottom, rebirth, renewal, and new beginnings, without realizing these metaphors trace back to some of the earliest human attempts to understand emotional cycles. The goddess also survives in the rhythms of desire itself. When someone feels drawn to another person with an intensity that reshapes their thoughts, their actions, or the direction of their life, they're participating in the same emotional field that ancient worshippers believed came from her. Desire wasn't a weakness to them. It was a powerful force that connected people to each other and to the cycle of life. Modern perspectives may frame desire differently, but the emotional experience remains similar, strong, surprising, and capable of shifting the direction of a life. Her presence is also evident in the way people respond to beauty. Beauty is not merely visual. It moves through sound, gesture, expression and emotion. It has the power to draw attention suddenly and unexpectedly. It has the ability to soften someone's mood or awaken longing they didn't realize they carried. These subtle reactions, often dismissed as simple preference, once formed part of the goddess's domain. When someone feels captivated by a moment, a colour in the sky, a piece of music, a voice, they touch an emotional pattern that ancient people linked to her influence, and in conflict, her memory appears again. Not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of confronting challenges with intensity. When someone stands firm in a difficult moment, or refuses to retreat when faced with adversity, or chooses to speak truth even when their voice shakes, they're drawing from the emotional reservoir that once shaped her warrior nature. They may not frame it as divine, but the emotional reality is the same. Her memory also lingers in the way humans seek connection. People still look for relationships that mirror some of the same patterns celebrated in the myths. Partnerships that feel equal, emotionally intense, transformative, and meaningful. They still feel drawn to people who ignite something powerful within them. They still experience longing that feels larger than reason. They still mourn losses that feel larger than words. They still celebrate reunions that feel like a return from darkness into light. These emotional experiences aren't modern inventions. They are part of the same emotional architecture that shaped the earliest images of Ishtar. And because those experiences continue, her memory continues. The fading of her name didn't erase her essence. It simply allowed it to move more quietly through human nature. People may not stand at temple gates or whisper her name into clay bowls, but they still experience the emotion she governed. They still navigate the intensity she represented. They still confront the duality she embodied. They still carry the contradictions she held within herself. Her memory shines in desire that feels overwhelming, in courage that emerges from vulnerability, in the fierce protection of what matters, in the quiet resilience that rises after loss, in the longing that accompanies connection, in the tension between tenderness and strength. These experiences bind people to something ancient, even if they never realize it. And although the world today looks nothing like the world where her worship was born, the emotional landscape remains remarkably similar. People still live through cycles of connection and separation. They still move through inner descents and returns. They still experience the shifting balance between love and conflict, longing and determination, fear and courage. The memory of Ishtar lives within those patterns. It lives within the way people love, the way they hurt, the way they hope, the way they rise after difficulty, the way they reach for something brighter, stronger, or more meaningful. Her presence may no longer burn in temple fires, but it burns in quieter places, in moments of emotional truth, in choices made with intensity, in the steady glow of the morning star that still rises, unchanged, over a world where her name once echoed across cities made of clay and stone. And though her story has travelled far beyond the boundaries of those ancient lands, the essence that shaped her myths remains, continuing forward, quietly, gently, persistently, into every heart that still carries the intertwined forces of love and strength.